Hey friend, welcome back. Grab your blanket, find that perfect spot where everything finally feels still, and let me take you somewhere tonight that I think you are going to find hard to forget. Imagine this. It is after midnight. The year is 1918, and somewhere deep in the Ural Mountains of Russia, inside a narrow basement room with low ceilings and bare walls, 4 young women are standing quietly. They're wearing white dresses, their hands are folded, their faces are calm, and sewn carefully into the layers of their clothing are diamonds, emeralds, sapphires, rubies, over a kilogram of precious stones per girl, stitched into the fabric months earlier during long quiet evenings in captivity. Nobody had told them what was about to happen. But somewhere deep down, perhaps they already knew. Those 4 girls were Grand Duchesses, daughters of the last Emperor of Russia, members of the House of Romanov, a dynasty that had ruled one of the most powerful empires on earth for over 300 years. And in the early hours of the 17th of July 1918, they were gone, just like that. An empire, a family, a dynasty, gone. Now here is what I want you to notice. History has spent over a century talking about the men of this story, the Tsar who abdicated, the revolutionary who took power, the soldiers who carried out the orders, but the women of the Romanov family, they were something else entirely. They were in so many ways the beating heart of that whole world, and their stories have been waiting to be told properly. So tonight and across the nights ahead, that is exactly what we are going to do. We're going to walk through the real lives of the Romanov women, not the myths, not the movie versions, not the Anastasia cartoon as much as we all secretly love that movie. The real women, their ambitions, their private fears, their impossible love stories, their moments of breathtaking courage. And yes, the choices, some brilliant, some heartbreaking, some simply human, that led an entire dynasty toward its end. But before we go further, if this kind of storytelling is something you look forward to, if history told this way feels different to you than a textbook ever did, do something small for me right now. Hit that subscribe button and leave a like on this video. It takes about 3 seconds, and it genuinely means the world to me. And if you are feeling generous tonight, drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching, from what time it is, whether you're already in bed with the lights off. I love reading those, truly. All right. Now, dim those lights as low as they will go. Let the room settle around you, and let's begin. To understand the women of the Romanov family, you first have to understand the world they lived inside. Picture this: St. Petersburg, Russia, the late 1800s, a city built on swamps and sheer imperial will, grand avenues lined with pastel-coloured palaces, bridges arching over frozen canals, the kind of cold that does not just chill you, it sits inside your bones and stays there. And at the very centre of all of it, the Russian imperial court, one of the last great royal courts of Europe, a place where women dressed in gowns that cost more than a factory worker would earn in a decade, where evenings meant candlelit ballrooms and orchestras and whispered conversations in French, because French at that time was considered the only truly civilized language, where power moved quietly, through a glance held a second too long, through who was invited to which dinner, through which woman had the ear of which minister. It looked like a fairy tale. From the outside, it absolutely looked like a fairy tale. But here is the thing about fairy tales. They almost never feel like one from the inside. Behind the gold and the silk and the breathtaking spectacle of the Russian imperial court were real women. Women who felt pressure that most of us will never understand. Women who were expected to be ornamental and powerful at the same time, beautiful and modest at the same time, devoted mothers and effective political operators at the same time. Women whose entire purpose from the moment they were born into royalty or married into it was to serve the dynasty, not themselves, the dynasty. And the dynasty by the end of the 19th century was under enormous pressure. Russia in the 1890s was a country stretched to its edges, 120 million people, vast forests, Arctic tundra, deserts, steppes that went on so long you could lose your mind looking at them, and underneath all that immense geography, a population that was deeply dangerously unhappy, peasants who worked land they did not own, factory workers in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg living in conditions that were, to put it gently, not conducive to long life, revolutionary ideas moving underground like fire through dry roots. The Romanov dynasty had ruled since 1613, over 300 years. But 300 years of power has a way of making people believe the power will simply continue, that it is natural, that it is permanent, that it is God-given. And that belief, that quiet, comfortable, deeply human belief that nothing will really change, may have been the most dangerous thing of all now. I want to paint you a picture of the women at the centre of this story, because there were several of them, and each one is extraordinary in her own right. There was Maria Feodorovna, the Empress Mother, a Danish princess by birth, a woman who came to Russia as a young girl and became over decades one of the sharpest political minds in the entire court. She survived things that would have broken most people, and she kept surviving, long after almost everyone else was gone. Then there was Alexandra, the last Empress of Russia, born a German princess granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England, a woman history has not always been kind to. A woman who was, depending on which historian you ask, either a tragic figure of immense love and impossible circumstances, or a deeply stubborn woman whose refusal to bend contributed to the fall of everything. Possibly both. Probably both. Then there were the four daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, known privately within the family by their shared nickname OTMA, the first letter of each of their names. 4 girls who grew up inside the most powerful family in Russia, but who were by most accounts raised with a kind of simplicity and warmth that you might not expect. They slept on hard cots, they bathed in cold water, they shared bedrooms, they had chores, they wrote letters, they took photographs obsessively, they teased each other and argued and made up and stayed up too late laughing. They were by every account devoted to each other in a way that was almost achingly beautiful. And here is something that I find genuinely moving about them. In all the photographs that survive, and there are hundreds because this family loved photography, in an era when photography was still new and remarkable, in almost every single one of those photographs, someone is smiling. Not the stiff, formal, painted-on smiles of official court portraits. Real smiles, the kind that reach the eyes, the kind that make you forget just for a moment what you already know is coming. Because you and I both know what is coming. That is part of what makes this story so hard to look away from. We are watching people live their lives with everything that entails the joy, the boredom, the love, the argument over whose turn it is to feed the dog, while the world outside is quietly, steadily, inexorably moving toward catastrophe. It is like watching a beautiful old house in the golden light of late afternoon, knowing that somewhere just out of frame the smoke has already started to rise. The Romanov dynasty officially ended on the 2nd of March 1917, when Tsar Nicholas II, the husband, the father, the man at the centre of everything, signed his abdication. He handed over 300 years of imperial power in a train compartment, with a pencil. Just like that. And in the months that followed, the women of the Romanov family, the Empress Alexandra, her 4 daughters, and eventually the Empress Mother Maria, would face circumstances that tested every single thing they were made of. Some of them showed grace under pressure that I think would genuinely stop you cold. Some of them showed the kind of stubborn, flawed, all-too-human refusal to accept reality that you and I have probably seen in people we love. Some of them showed both sometimes on the same afternoon, and here is what I want you to hold on to as we go through this together. This is not a story about villains and heroes. It is not a story about whether the revolution was right or wrong. It is a story about women, real women, who happen to be born into or married into one of the most extraordinary and volatile moments in modern history. Women who love deeply, who failed sometimes, who hoped until the very last moment, and who faced what came with a kind of quiet dignity that honestly I am not sure I could match. Over the next 11 parts of this series, we're going to move through their lives in a way that feels close. Not the sweeping historical overview you get in a documentary, something more intimate than that. We're going to stand in the rooms where they stood. We're going to read the letters they wrote late at night. We're going to understand as best we can across the distance of 100 years what it actually felt like to be them. And we are going to start right at the beginning, not with Alexandra, not with the daughters. We are going to start with the woman who in many ways made all of them possible. A girl from a small northern kingdom who arrived in Russia in the 1860s and became, well, you will see. She's not someone you will forget easily. So settle in a little deeper. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breath slow. Because the story of the Romanov women begins long before the dynasty ended. It begins with a Danish princess named Dagmar, a young woman in love with one man about to be handed to another, and the quiet, extraordinary decision she made that would shape the next 50 years of Russian history. That is where we are going next. Right then, let's go back. All the way back to a small yellow house on a quiet street in Copenhagen, Denmark. The year is 1847, and somewhere inside that modest building, not a palace mind you, but a genuinely modest house on a soldier's salary, a baby girl is born. Her name is Dagmar, and absolutely nobody on earth in that moment could have imagined what her life was about to become. Here is something I find quietly remarkable about this story before it even begins properly. Dagmar's father, Prince Christian, was from a minor branch of the Danish royal family. So minor, in fact, that the family lived on roughly £800 a year, which sounds like a lot until you understand that this was the income of a man expected to raise daughters who would one day move in European royal circles. The family was genteel but genuinely stretched thin. No grand palace, no vast estates, just a small yellow house, a sensible mother who believed deeply in education, and 6 children being raised with the quiet understanding that one day their good breeding and their manners and their grace under pressure would matter far more than their bank account. And it turns out that quiet mother was absolutely right, because here is where the story takes its first extraordinary turn. In 1863, when Dagmar is just 16 years old, her father is suddenly elevated. He becomes King Christian IX of Denmark. Overnight, the girl from the modest yellow house is a king's daughter. And in the world of the 1860s, being a king's daughter with good looks and an excellent education is roughly the equivalent of being suddenly handed a VIP pass to every royal court in Europe. Her family would eventually become so well connected through marriage that historians nicknamed Christian IX the father-in-law of Europe. One of Dagmar's sisters, Alexandra, would marry the future King of England. One of her brothers would become King of Greece. And Dagmar herself, well, she was about to be offered the greatest stage of all. Picture this moment. It is 1864. A young Russian nobleman arrives in Copenhagen. His name is Nicholas Alexandrovich Tsarevich, of Russia, heir to the largest empire on earth. He is tall and gentle and well-read. The court calls him Nixa. He is 20 years old. Dagmar is 17. And when they meet, something happens between them that the historical record captures with an almost uncomfortable sweetness. He describes her in letters home as charming. She finds him handsome and kind. Within months they are engaged. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because this is not the cold political transaction you might expect from royal matchmaking in the 1800s. These two young people genuinely liked each other. They wrote daily letters, long letters, the kind you stay up past midnight writing. When Nicholas travelled south to Florence for his health, he had developed troubling symptoms that the doctors were not yet taking seriously enough. Dagmar kept up her end of the correspondence faithfully. and in one letter she teased him gently, asking whether he had perhaps fallen in love with, as she put it, a dark-eyed Italian. It was the joke of someone who felt safe, someone who believed the future was settled and bright. It was not settled. In April of 1865, a telegram arrived in Copenhagen. It read simply, "Nicholas has received the last rites. Pray for us, and come if you can." Dagmar and her mother travelled immediately to Nice, France, where Nicholas lay dying of cerebrospinal meningitis at the Villa Bermont. When Dagmar walked into the room, Nicholas, barely conscious, barely there, whispered to his mother, "Isn't she just charming?" He died on the 22nd of April 1865. He was 21 years old. He had a tear on his cheek. Now pause for a moment, because what happened next is one of those historical scenes that feels almost too extraordinary to be real. But it is real. On his deathbed, Nicholas took the hand of his grieving fiancée and the hand of his younger brother Alexander, and he pressed them together. He asked Alexander to take care of her. He asked Dagmar to marry his brother, his last request, his last breath of agency in a life that was ending far too soon. Think about what Dagmar must have felt in that room. She was 17 years old. She had travelled across Europe to be at the bedside of the man she was supposed to marry. She was watching him die. And in the same room, in the same terrible hour, the shape of her entire future was being quietly rearranged around her grief. Contemporary accounts say that when Nicholas finally stopped breathing, the family had to physically pull Dagmar away from his body. She was so devastated when she returned to Denmark that her relatives genuinely feared for her health. She barely ate. She barely slept. For a while, she barely spoke. Have you ever lost something, not just a person, but an entire version of your future, in a single moment, the house you thought you'd live in, the path you thought your life would take? There is a particular kind of grief that is not just for what was lost, but for everything that was supposed to come next. That is what Dagmar was sitting inside alone in Copenhagen in the spring of 1865, and yet, a year later, almost exactly to the month, she agreed to go back. Not to forget Nicholas, not to simply trade one man for another, but because, and this part is genuinely complicated and worth thinking about, she'd already fallen in love with Russia. Even before she had lived there, even before the grief, even before any of it. She had dreamed of that vast country the way some people dream of a place they have never been, but somehow know they belong to. And the man she was now being asked to marry was not a stranger. Alexander Nicholas's younger brother, the new Tsarevich, had been in that room too. He had watched his older brother die. He had heard the same request, and something quiet and significant had already begun between them, sitting at that bedside in the most tender and broken circumstances imaginable. What historians later discovered, somewhat delightfully, is that Alexander had actually been secretly in love with Dagmar for some time already. He had seen her at court during the engagement to his brother, admired her from a careful and respectful distance, and kept his feelings entirely to himself out of loyalty. Which, honestly, if you think about it, is a rather extraordinary act of restraint from a man who was, by all accounts, built like a wardrobe and not known for his patience. Alexander III of Russia was enormous, well over 6 feet tall. He could bend iron pokers with his bare hands at dinner parties, which was apparently his preferred party trick. He was also deeply, genuinely shy, and he had loved this small Danish girl quietly without saying a word for over a year. On the 2nd of June 1866, Alexander travelled to Copenhagen to visit Dagmar. The two of them sat together looking through photographs of Nicholas, and in that moment, surrounded by the images of the man who'd connected them, who had loved them both, Alexander asked Dagmar to marry him. She said yes. She told him she could still love him, led in part by her devotion to his late brother. That is the foundation of this marriage, Not political strategy, not cold calculation, grief and gentleness and the strange alchemy of two people who came together through loss and found something real on the other side of it. Alexander called her his angel for the rest of his life. She called him Sasha. After the wedding night, he wrote in his diary simply and without any royal formality whatsoever that he could not quite put into words how he felt, which honestly makes him more human to me than almost anything else in the history books. The wedding itself took place on the 9th of November 1866 in the Imperial Chapel of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. Dagmar arrived in Russia on a warship. She converted to Russian Orthodoxy as all foreign-born consorts were required to do. She took a new name, Maria Feodorovna, and she stepped off that ship into a country she had never lived in, whose language she did not yet speak, whose religion was entirely new to her, whose customs were vast and complicated, and entirely unlike anything she had known in her small yellow house in Copenhagen. And what did she do? She learned. She sat with tutors every single day. She learned the Russian language not as a political obligation, but because she genuinely wanted to understand the people she was going to live among. Within a short time, she was speaking Russian fluently. She threw herself into the charitable work expected of an imperial consort, and then went considerably further than expected. She eventually took patronage over 450 charitable institutions across Russia. 450. She founded schools for young girls. She served as president of the Russian Red Cross. Her husband called her the guardian angel of Russia and the Russian people. They adored her. Absolutely and almost fanatically adored her. There are historical accounts of public appearances where the crowds cheered, primarily for her. Not for her husband, the heir to the empire. For her, the small Danish girl who had taught herself to belong. She had a warmth to her, a natural ability to make people feel seen that no amount of royal tutoring can manufacture. Either you have it or you do not. Dagmar had it. I want to give you one small detail here that I think says more than anything else could. One afternoon during a public appearance, police officers began roughly beating a group of student protesters in the street. Dagmar was watching. She turned to the officers and said calmly but clearly, "They were quite loyal. They cheered me. Why do you allow the police to treat them so brutally? That is not the response of a woman who has learned to perform concern. That is someone who genuinely noticed the people standing in front of her, and who was not afraid to say so." For 13 years before Alexander became Tsar Dagmar, now Maria Feodorovna held court at the Anichkov Palace in St. Petersburg. She and Alexander were happy in a way that seems almost startlingly domestic given the scale of their lives. They had 6 children together. Their eldest son was born in 1868. His name was Nicholas, the boy who would one day become the last Tsar of Russia. But that is a story for later. Because right now I want to stay with Maria for a moment longer. With the woman she'd become by the time Alexander finally ascended to the throne in 1881 after the assassination of his own father, Tsar Alexander II, which is a whole other story, a brutal and terrible one. By that point, Maria Feodorovna was 33 years old. She had been in Russia for 15 years. She had buried grief, built a marriage, raised children, learned a language, won a people. And when she became empress, she brought with her something that is genuinely rare in the history of royal courts. She brought the knowledge that she had earned her place, not through birth, not through luck, through work and grief and love and the stubborn insistence on showing up, even when every reason to stay in Denmark would have been entirely understandable. There is detail about Maria Feodorovna that I always come back to. She was 5 feet tall, tiny, physically small in every way, and she spent her life in rooms full of people with far more institutional power than she would ever formally hold. But here is the thing about her that every memoir, every letter, every court account agrees on. When Maria Feodorovna walked into a room, everyone knew it. Not because she demanded it, because she had that quality, that particular uncopyable quality of someone who is fully, completely, genuinely present. Duchess Cecilia of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, who knew her later in life, wrote that Maria had the most distinguished and forceful personality, and that the intelligence which shone in her face made her the perfect figure of a queen. And yet she never used that intelligence to dominate. She used it to read rooms, to manage relationships, to quietly steer things in directions she believed were right, without fanfare, without self-congratulation, just steady, elegant influence exercised so naturally that most people around her probably did not even notice it happening. She outlived almost everyone. Her husband died in 1894, just 49 years old, his enormous body worn down by kidney disease. She wrote in her diary that night, "I am utterly heartbroken and despondent." And then she wrote something that I find almost unbearably moving. But when I saw the blissful smile and the peace in his face that came after, it gave me strength. Even in the worst moment, she was looking for the thing that would let her keep going. She did not fall apart. She grieved fully, honestly, privately, and then she got back up. Because she always got back up. What happens after that in the long stretch of years between Alexander's death and the eventual collapse of everything Maria had built her life around is a story I find myself genuinely wanting to sit inside with you. Because the woman who steps forward as Empress Dowager, the mother of the new Tsar, living now in the long complicated shadow of a daughter-in-law she will never quite understand, is one of the most quietly fascinating figures of her age. She sees what is coming long before most people do. She warns, she pleads, she argues, she tries, and she is not heard. But that story belongs to a later night. For now, what I want you to carry with you as you drift towards sleep is the image of a 17-year-old girl from a small yellow house in Copenhagen, standing at a deathbed in Nice, France, in the spring of 1865, every future she had ever imagined dissolving, and choosing somehow to walk toward a new one anyway, on nothing but courage and grief, and the faint warmth of a hand pressed into hers by a dying young man who believed with his last breath that the two people he loved most in the world could find their way to something good together. He was right. He was right about that. Now, there is another woman waiting in the wings of this story. A woman who, unlike Maria, did not manage to win the Russian people the way Maria did. A woman whose childhood was so different from Dagmar's easy warmth that the contrast between the two of them would in time shape the fate of an entire empire. She was born a German princess. She was raised in the shadow of Queen Victoria. Her childhood nickname was Sunny, and she spent the rest of her life trying to find her way back to that lightness. Her name was Alex, and her story is one I've been looking forward to telling you. So we just left Maria Feodorovna, a woman who arrived in Russia as a stranger and made it entirely her own, who learned the language, won the people, and built something real and lasting out of grief and sheer stubborn warmth. She sets the stage almost perfectly for the next woman in this story, because the woman who comes next arrives in Russia with just as much love in her heart and walks away with none of the same result. Same country, same court, same role, entirely different outcome. And the question of why, of what made the difference, is one I find myself turning over every time I come back to this story. Her full name at birth was Victoria Alex Helena Louise Beatrice of Hesse, and by Rhine. Most people in history know her as Alexandra Feodorovna, but long before any of that she was just Alex. And before she was Alex to anyone outside the nursery, she was Sunny. That was her mother's name for her. because she was by every account we have genuinely radiant as a small child, round-cheeked, laughing often, dragging her little sister May everywhere she went with the particular confidence of a child who has not yet learned that the world can take things from you. She was born in Darmstadt, Germany, on the 6th of June 1872, the sixth child of 7. Now, before I go further, I want to tell you something about her mother, because her mother is crucial. Princess Alice of the United Kingdom was the second daughter of Queen Victoria. She was known throughout Europe as one of the more thoughtful, quietly radical members of the Victorian royal family. Alice believed in education for girls. She believed in nursing as a genuine profession, not just charitable dabbling. She was warm, engaged, intellectually restless, the kind of mother who would sit on the floor and play with her children, rather than hand them off to a governess and appear for 20 minutes at tea time. Alex adored her. And in the nursery of the Grand Ducal Palace in Darmstadt, surrounded by sisters and a beloved brother Ernie, and a mother who actually seemed to enjoy being in the room with her children, Alex was happy, simply uncomplicated childhood, happy. She described her early years later in life as unclouded sunshine, which makes what happened next feel even more brutal. November 1878. Diphtheria swept through the palace. It moved through that household like something with intent touching one child, then another, then another. Alex fell ill. Her brother Ernst fell ill. Her father, her sisters, one by one, the whole family went down. Princess Alice, their mother, nursed them herself, refused to step away, sat at bedsides through the night, held small hands, whispered reassurances, stayed, the kind of mother who would not leave. And when little May, Alex's closest sister, 2 years younger, the one they called inseparable from Alex when May died on the 16th of November, Alice chose to keep it from the other children for a while. She was trying to protect them from grief while they were still too ill to bear it. Then, on the 14th of December 1878, Princess Alice herself died. She had caught the infection from her son Ernst while trying to comfort him after he learned about May. She was 35 years old. Alex was 6. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 6 years old. The person who called you Sonny. Gone. Everything that was soft and warm and safe in the world gone in a single month. Her toys were burned, incinerated out of fear of the disease spreading. Everything from before, burned. There is something that happens to some children when grief arrives before they have any framework to hold it. They do not fall apart in dramatic ways. They go quiet. They learn to contain. They build over the soft and vulnerable parts of themselves something harder and more protective. And from that point on, everyone who knew Alex noticed the change. The round-cheeked, laughing child who dragged her sister everywhere and earned a nickname for her brightness became something more careful, more watchful, more interior. One contemporary reflecting on Alex years later said she'd become almost pedantic, precise, controlled, reluctant to let things out where they might be seen. I think that is far too clinical a word for what actually happened to a 6-year-old girl. What happened is that she learned in the most irreversible way possible that the people you love can simply disappear. And once you know that, you hold what you have a little tighter. You do not give yourself away easily. You do not warm to strangers in a room. After Alice's death, Queen Victoria stepped in. She became, as she put it, a second mother to Alex and her siblings, and so Alex grew up between Darmstadt and Windsor, and the Isle of Wight, spending long stretches with her grandmother, the most powerful woman in the Western world, a woman who was also perhaps not coincidentally famous for her emotional restraint, her strong opinions, her deep religiosity, and her absolute certainty that she knew best. Alex absorbed all of it. The faith, the discipline, the sense of duty carried in the spine. She became, by her own description, more English than German in her habits and sensibility, and she grew up quietly adoring Grandmama Victoria, even as she quietly chafed under the weight of that watchful managing presence. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that feels, looking back, almost fated. June 1884. 12-year-old Alex travels to St. Petersburg for the wedding of her older sister, Elizabeth Ella, as they called her, to Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia, and at that wedding she meets a boy. His name is Nicholas Alexandrovich. He is 16 years old. He is the Tsarevich of Russia, heir to the throne. He has blue eyes. What happened at that wedding is the kind of detail that feels almost too perfectly cinematic. Nicholas noticed Alex immediately. He wrote in his diary afterward about "sweet little Alex," in the way that 16-year-old boys have been writing about girls they are slightly overwhelmed by since the beginning of diaries. And before she left, he gave her a small brooch as a keepsake. She accepted it, then panicked and sent it back. She was 12. He was 16. She was not sure what any of it meant, and the safest thing felt like returning the gift and pretending the whole encounter had been ordinary. It was not ordinary. They did not see each other again for 5 years. In 1889, Alex returned to Russia to visit Ella. She was 17 now, he was 21, and whatever had flickered between them in 1884 had grown in the intervening years of separation and occasional letters into something considerably more serious. They spent 6 weeks in each other's company, playing badminton, ice skating, attending family dinners where they sat across tables from each other and pretended to be perfectly composed. By the time she left, both families had noticed, and both families were in their own different ways against it. This is the part of Alex's story that I think deserves far more attention than it usually gets, because the obstacles between her and Nicholas were not just logistical. They were coming from every direction all at once. Nicholas's parents, the formidable Alexander III and Maria Feodorovna, opposed the match. They considered Alex too German, too low in standing for their son, and Maria Feodorovna, whose own anti-German feeling ran deep for reasons rooted in Danish history, was particularly cool on the idea. Queen Victoria, on the other side, was also opposed for almost exactly opposite reasons. She liked Nicholas well enough personally, but she distrusted Russia as a country. She feared what that world would do to her favourite granddaughter. And then there was Alex herself, who loved Nicholas clearly and quietly and completely, and could not say yes. Not because she did not want to marry him, but because marrying the heir to Russia meant converting from the Lutheran faith she'd been raised in to Russian Orthodoxy. And she had made a promise to her dying father, Grand Duke Louis, before his death in 1892, a promise to remain true to the faith she'd been baptized into. She was not willing to break that promise, not even for the man she loved. I find this particular detail about Alex genuinely striking, and I want to linger on it, because it tells you something important about who she really was underneath the shyness and the reputation for coldness that would dog her later. This was not a woman without conviction. This was not a woman who simply did whatever she was told. She turned down multiple proposals. She turned down a match that Queen Victoria herself had arranged to Prince Albert Victor, heir apparent to the British throne. She said no. She said no to being Queen of England, because she had already decided. Nicholas waited. He wrote to her. He was respectful. He was persistent. He was in the quiet, gentle, slightly stubborn way that characterized nearly everything he did, simply steady. His parents initially refused to give the relationship their blessing. They consented only in 1894, when Alexander III's health began its steep decline, when it became clear that Nicholas would need someone beside him sooner than anyone had planned. In April of 1894, Nicholas travelled to Coburg, Germany for the wedding of Alex's brother Ernst. He proposed. She refused again. She was still fighting with herself over the conversion, still trying to reconcile the promise to her father with the pull of the future. Then something shifted. Her sister Ella, who had made the same conversion 10 years earlier, sat with her and talked to her honestly. She told Alex what she had found on the other side of the change, that the two faiths shared far more than they differed, that no promise to anyone's memory required suffering in this way, that she could remain who she was and still step forward. And something in Alex let go. She went back to Nicholas the following day. She was crying. He was holding both her hands, and she said yes. Their engagement was announced on the 20th of April 1894. Nicholas wrote in his diary that night, "A wonderful, unforgettable day in my life. This is the day of my engagement to my darling, adorable Alex." He called her Sunny, the same name her mother had given her. He was the only other person in her adult life who ever used it. But then the world moved fast. That same autumn, Alexander III died. October 1894, just 49 years old, and Nicholas, who had never been properly prepared to rule, who by his own admission felt entirely unready, suddenly was Tsar. And the wedding, which should have been a celebration, a season of joy, had to be moved forward immediately. It took place in November of 1894, 3 weeks after the funeral, and that, I think, is the first piece of the puzzle. The first chip in something that might otherwise have been fine. Because Alex arrived in Russia not in triumph but in grief. She came in on the heels of a funeral, the country was in mourning, and the first impression the Russian people formed of their new empress was of a young woman in black riding through the streets of St. Petersburg in a funeral procession. Someone in the crowd was overheard saying something that sent a chill through court. She comes to us behind a coffin. It was not her fault. None of the timing was her fault. But in the court of public perception, which operates not on fairness, but on impression, it stuck. And it planted a seed of something that would grow slowly and steadily into a wall between Alexandra and the Russian people that she was never able to fully dismantle. Because here is the cruel irony at the centre of her story. The shyness that had protected her since she was 6 years old, the careful interior life she had built around the loss of her mother and her sister, that very same self-protective reserve looked from the outside like something else entirely. It looked like coldness. It looked like contempt. It looked like the arrogance of a foreigner who did not care enough to try. And the contrast with Maria Feodorovna, who was still very much alive, still beloved, still holding court in her own palace, with her considerable social gifts on full display, made everything worse. Russians had been adoring Maria Feodorovna for nearly 30 years, and now, by the ancient custom of the court, the Dowager Empress technically outranked the new Empress in many ceremonial matters. Alexandra walked into a situation where she was being compared daily to someone who had spent decades building exactly the skills Alexandra lacked, and compared unfavourably, almost from the first day. One court observer watching Alexandra at an official reception noted that where Maria would move through a crowd, effortlessly touching an arm here, laughing warmly there, remembering names, leaving people feeling seen, Alexandra would stand with a rigid smile that did not reach her eyes, visibly agonized by the room unable to make the simple, human connections that would have transformed how she was perceived. She was not cold. She was terrified. But terror and coldness look identical from across a ballroom floor. A woman who knew her well wrote this about Alexandra years later, and I think it is one of the most precise and compassionate descriptions I have ever read. Very restrained and rather silent. She was extremely shy, and because of this she was often misunderstood. She was too sensitive, and she was haunted by the idea that she was unpopular and unloved. Haunted by the idea that she was unpopular and unloved. Think about that. She already knew. She walked through every room already knowing that people did not warm to her, already feeling the gap between who she was inside the woman who loved deeply, who had faith that moved her to tears, who wrote long, passionate letters and laughed genuinely with people she trusted, and who the room saw when she walked in. That gap, that permanent, painful gap between the self you know you are and the person the world has decided to see, is its own particular kind of loneliness. And yet, within her family, behind closed doors, away from the court and the ballrooms and the expectations of public performance, Alexandra was completely different. She was funny, genuinely, surprisingly funny. She was tender with her children in a way that astonished people who had expected imperial distance. She loved music. She painted. She kept a journal that reads in places with an emotional openness and self-awareness that is quite beautiful. She was passionately, almost overwhelmingly devoted to her husband, and he to her, which raises a question worth sitting with tonight. What might have happened if Alexandra had arrived differently, if she had come to Russia not in mourning, but in celebration with a year or two to find her footing before the full weight of the throne descended? If she'd been given the same slow, decades-long runway that Maria Feodorovna had been given to learn the language, understand the people, build the relationships that eventually made her beloved? Would the shyness have softened? Would the distance have closed? Would the story have ended differently? We cannot know. History does not offer those kinds of second chances, but I think about it. Because the woman who came to Russia in that November of 1894 was not the woman history would later make her out to be. She was 22 years old. She had buried her mother at 6, her sister at 6, her father at 22. She had fought for years an internal battle between love and faith. She had said no to a crown in England because she had already made her choice. She had crossed Europe for a man she loved, and walked into a country that would never quite decide to love her back. She was brave in all the ways that don't get remembered, and she was about to face something that would test every one of those quiet interior resources in ways she could not yet imagine, because in just a few years a child would be born into that marriage. A boy Russia had been praying for, a boy whose birth would be celebrated across the empire with a joy so immense it shook the walls of St. Petersburg. And then very quietly in the days after his birth the truth would begin to surface, a truth that Alexandra alone would carry at first, a truth that would change everything. His name was Alexei, and what was living in his blood had already been living in hers, waiting all along to be passed on. There is a particular kind of love story that history tends to remember as romantic, star-crossed, devoted, against all odds. And then slowly, as you look more carefully, you start to see the edges of it. The places where the love, real as it was, deep as it was, quietly became something else. A shelter, a wall, a world just small enough for two people built so carefully to keep everything else out, that in the end everything else found a way in anyway. The love story of Nicholas and Alexandra is one of those. Let me set the scene for what their marriage actually looked like from the inside, because I think most people, when they picture the last Tsar and Tsarina of Russia, imagine formality, grand halls, stiff portraits, the careful distance of imperial life. The reality was startlingly ordinary. Nicholas kept a diary every single day of his adult life, and what fills those pages, what this man wrote about again and again and again while ruling 1/6 of the Earth's surface, is his family, his daughters' birthdays, what they ate for breakfast, how long he walked in the garden, whether Alex had a headache. On one entry after a full day that presumably included matters of imperial governance, he noted with evident satisfaction that he'd been canoeing, killed a raven, and that the grass was unusually thick. I am not making that up. The man was in his private heart a country gentleman who happened to be born into the wrong job by about several centuries, and Alexandra. She wrote letters to Nicholas every single day when they were apart. Long letters that are in places genuinely beautiful. In one she wrote to him, "I want to show you all the intense love I have for you. Warm cheer, console strengthen you and make you sure of yourself." She numbered her letters. By the time the war came, she was writing him letters numbered in the hundreds. Every single one signed your very own wife, Sunny. That name she'd been given as a child by a mother she lost at 6. Only 2 people in her entire life used it. Her mother and him. Now here is what I want you to think about as we move through this part of the story. Because the love between these 2 people was real. Nobody who's ever read the letters seriously disputes that. They are devoted to each other in a way that is honestly rare in any marriage, let alone a royal one. They were faithful. They were affectionate. Nicholas found his children genuinely delightful and made time for them in ways that were unusual for a man of his position and era. Alexandra gave her husband the kind of steady, fiercely loyal emotional support that probably held him together on more than one occasion. By every domestic measure, this was a good marriage, a real one. But, and this is a significant but, their love for each other and the family they built around it gradually became something that functioned almost like a closed system. Think about it this way. Nicholas had 4 daughters and a son. He had a wife who adored him. He had a small circle of close friends. He had Tsarskoye Selo, the private imperial residence outside St. Petersburg, which is exactly as beautiful as it sounds, and which the family treated not as a palace but as a home. They picnicked there. They took photographs there obsessively, because both Nicholas and Alexandra were genuinely in love with the relatively new technology of photography. They had dogs. They had inside jokes. They put on little plays. They were in the protected circle of Tsarskoye Selo, an entirely happy family. And the problem gradually was that Tsarskoye Selo was not Russia. Russia in the years after 1894 was a country in open distress. Millions of peasants living in conditions that had barely changed since serfdom was abolished in 1861. A rising industrial working class packed into cities without adequate housing, without safety regulations, working 14-hour days, in factories that made the word dangerous sound almost cheerful. Revolutionary ideas spreading through universities, through underground pamphlets, through whispered conversations in the kind of places that the people at Tsarskoye Selo did not visit. And while all of that was building, Nicholas was writing in his diary about the thickness of the grass. I want to be fair to both of them here because it would be easy to simply say they were oblivious. They were not entirely oblivious. Nicholas knew there was unrest. He received reports. He had ministers who told him things. The problem was not that he didn't know. The problem was something more subtle. He was a man who experienced the world primarily through his family. His emotional reality was shaped by the people sitting across from him at breakfast. And the people sitting across from him at breakfast were people who loved him completely and told him every day that he was doing his best. That is not a criticism of Alexandra. That is a description of how love under certain conditions can become a kind of insulation from truth. The first truly public signal that something was wrong, not with the country, not yet, but with the story. The new Tsar and Tsarina were telling themselves about how they were being received, came in May of 1896. The coronation. Nicholas and Alexandra were crowned in Moscow with the full spectacular, almost incomprehensible pageantry of the Russian imperial tradition. Thousands of people poured into the city. The ceremonies lasted weeks. 4 days after the coronation itself, a public festival was held at Kudinka Field 5 miles north of the city. 500,000 people came. Every Russian was invited. There would be food, gifts, celebration, a gesture of generosity from their new monarch to his people. Nobody had checked the field properly. Kudinka Field was covered with ditches and trenches left over from old military exercises. The crowd surged forward. People fell into the trenches, others fell on top of them. By the time it was over, at least 1,300 people had been trampled. 1,300. Some estimates are higher. Nicholas was told at 10:30 in the morning. He was by all accounts genuinely shocked and sorrowful. His first instinct was to cancel the day's remaining schedule, including a ball at the French embassy that evening. He wanted to visit the wounded. He wanted to honour the dead. And then his advisors stepped in. His uncles, his ministers, the whole machinery of court management, they told him he could not cancel. France was Russia's only meaningful European ally. The ambassador had sent tapestry from Versailles. 100,000 roses had been shipped from the south of France. Cancelling would cause a diplomatic incident. He went. The image that reached the Russian public was of their new Tsar with his beautiful German wife drinking champagne and waltzing at a glittering French embassy ball on the night that 1,300 of his subjects had been crushed to death in a field. It was not a fair image. He had visited the hospitals. He had set aside money from his own treasury for the families of the dead. But fairness is rarely the first thing that moves through a crowd. The story that stuck was the story of the ball. The cup given out at the festival, a small porcelain souvenir, became known ever after as the Cup of Sorrows. And Leo Tolstoy, who was watching all of this from his estate, with the particular acid clarity of a man who had given up on pretending the upper classes deserved their position, began writing a story about Kudinka Field. He never finished it. But the fact that he started says something. Here is what strikes me about this moment. Nicholas made the wrong call at Kudinka. He knew it. He felt it. His diary entry that day, which begins with the tragedy, calls it awful and a disgusting impression, quickly shifts to a dry chronicle of the dinner and the speeches and the delegations he received. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know what else to do. He'd been taught his whole life that the Tsar's role was to maintain the image of stability, to go on, to not show the cracks. And so he went on, and showed the cracks anyway in a much more damaging way. Alexandra, meanwhile, was navigating something privately even more fraught. Because while the coronation was unfolding, and while Russia was beginning to form its opinions of the new empress, that she was cold, that she was foreign, that she could not fill Maria Feodorovna's shoes, Alexandra was quietly, methodically trying to give Russia what everyone expected her to provide. An heir. The pressure on an empress to produce a son in the 1890s was, to put it very gently, immense. The Romanov dynasty's continuation depended on it. The entire court was watching. Alex became pregnant almost immediately after the wedding. Their first child, Olga, was born in 1895, a daughter. The Russian court's disappointment was not subtle. Tatiana came in 1897, another daughter, Maria, in 1899. 3 daughters. The murmuring grew louder. Anastasia in 1901, 4 daughters. By this point, Alexandra had developed what her doctors quietly described as a nervous condition. This is not hard to understand. She had been in Russia for 7 years. She had never managed to win the public over. She was constantly, exhaustingly compared to her mother-in-law. She'd given birth 4 times. She was watching her husband struggle with a role for which he'd been at best inadequately prepared, and she was carrying silently the knowledge that something had been passed down through her blood, something she had inherited from her grandmother Victoria, something her brother Friedrich had died of as a child, but she did not yet know, not for certain, whether it had found its way into this new generation. In 1903 she experienced a false pregnancy. The hope it had raised and then the collapse of that hope was devastating. Those who saw her up close that year said she aged visibly. Then, on the 30th of July 1904, she gave birth to a son, Alexei Nikolaevich, the heir Russia had been waiting for. Nicholas wrote in his diary that there were simply no words enough to thank God. The empire celebrated. Bells rang across St. Petersburg, cannons fired, and then a few days later the baby began to bleed. From his navel, the bleeding would not stop. It was haemophilia. The same condition that had claimed Alexandra's older brother Friedrich in 1873 when he fell from a window and the blood simply would not clot. The same condition that had coursed quietly through the family of Queen Victoria like a slow, invisible fault line through stone passed by the women who carried it, expressed in the sons who suffered from it. Alexandra had known somewhere beneath the hope that this was possible. The fear had lived in her since before Alexei was born, and now it was confirmed. They kept it secret. For years they kept it almost entirely secret. Only the closest household staff knew. The Russian public, the court, the ministers. Nobody was told that the heir to the throne had a condition which meant that any ordinary bruise, any fall, any knock of the elbow against a chair could send him into a spiral of internal bleeding that the doctors of that era could not reliably stop. I understand the impulse. Any parent would understand it. But the secrecy had consequences that neither Nicholas nor Alexandra could fully trace in the moment. Because the secrecy, the walls they built around Alexei's condition, became another layer in the walls they had already been building around themselves. Another reason to withdraw. Another reason to explain nothing. Another reason why a woman who was already struggling to connect with the Russian people became, in the eyes of those same people, even more remote and inscrutable. She had a reason. They just didn't know what it was. And somewhere in the space between Alexei's diagnosis and the desperate search for help that would follow, something shifted in Alexandra. The woman who had once been trained in English practicality and German Lutheran restraint began turning more and more completely inward, toward faith, toward mysticism, toward anyone who might offer something the doctors could not. And the door that opened from that turn was the door through which Rasputin eventually walked. But that is a story that deserves its own telling, and it is coming. What I want to leave you with for now is this. The love story of Nicholas and Alexandra was real. There is no question of that, and love when it is real deserves to be seen clearly. Not sanitized into fairy tale, not reduced to cautionary tale, but seen, with all of it. The joy of the long letters and the photographs and the children chasing dogs through the gardens of Tsarskoye Selo, and the sorrow of two people who loved each other so deeply, so completely, so exclusively, that they built a world just the right size for their family, and left very little room inside it for the enormous, complicated, restless country that was depending on them. That is the love story, both of those things at once. The next chapter of this story belongs to the man who understood that better than anyone, a Siberian peasant, barely literate, eyes that people described over and over as impossible to look away from. He walked into the palace not with power or title. He walked in through a mother's fear, and that, it turns out, was enough. Somewhere in the Palace of Windsor in the 1850s a mutation occurred. Nobody noticed. Nobody could have. It happened at the level of a single chromosome so small that no instrument of the time could have detected it, so quiet in its origins that it left no trace anyone could read. Queen Victoria of England carried it her entire life without ever knowing it was there. She was healthy, she was vigorous, she lived to 81, The mutation moved through her like a passenger in the dark, invisible patient waiting for the right conditions to make itself known. Those conditions arrived in her children, and her children's children, and eventually in a cold October night in Poland in the year 1912. It nearly brought the whole thing down. Let me explain what haemophilia actually does before we go further, because I think the way it is usually described, a condition where blood doesn't clot properly, understates the reality considerably. A haemophiliac, when injured, does not simply bleed more than usual. The blood that should be forming a seal across the wound, building its careful clot, has lost one of the key proteins it needs to do the job, and so the bleeding simply continues, not in a rush, not all at once, but steadily, persistently, most dangerously internally inside joints, inside muscles, into the abdomen, where you cannot see it, cannot press a cloth against it, cannot do anything except watch the swelling grow and the pain increase and the vital signs begin their slow decline. In the early 1900s, before modern treatments existed, a severe bleeding episode in a haemophiliac child was essentially a death sentence wearing a question mark. You could not stop it, you could only wait. Queen Victoria's son Leopold had the condition. He was frail as a child, bruised easily, was in pain frequently, and died at 30 years old after a fall that would have been entirely unremarkable for anyone else. Victoria's daughter, Alice. Alex's mother, the woman who died nursing her children through diphtheria, was a carrier. She passed it to her son, Friedrich, who died at 2 years old after a fall from a window triggered unstoppable internal bleeding. Friedrich's death happened when Alex was still a baby. She never knew him, but the gene that took Friedrich was already travelling silently through the same bloodline, travelling toward her. Here is the thing that makes this story genuinely haunting at a medical level, and I find myself still surprised by it every time I think about it carefully. The haemophilia that moved through Victoria's family was confirmed through genetic analysis of Romanov remains conducted in 2009 to have been haemophilia B, sometimes called Christmas disease, not the more common haemophilia A, the specific type B, and the evidence strongly suggests that Victoria herself was the origin of it. Not her parents, not her grandparents, no record of it in either family line before Victoria, which means as far as geneticists can determine, the mutation arose spontaneously. In Victoria herself, out of nothing, a single damaged chromosome in the most powerful grandmother in Europe passed quietly down through decades of carefully arranged marriages spreading across royal courts, from Russia to Spain to Germany, until it touched in the end the boy who would have inherited 1/6 of the Earth's surface. There is something almost incomprehensibly strange about that. One woman, one chromosome, one mutation that nobody chose and nobody caused, and the trail it left through history. Now, back to Alexandra. She knew about Friedrich. She knew about her brother Friedrich before Alexei was born, that small boy who died when he bled from a cut ear for 3 days, then fell from a window. Did she know she might be carrying the gene herself? Historians believe she must have suspected it. The science of genetic transmission was barely understood in the early 1900s, but the pattern in the family was visible enough that some people had begun to piece it together. And yet, she had 4 daughters first, 4 healthy girls, and with each healthy daughter perhaps the fear receded a little. Daughters, she could tell herself, did not get it. Daughters were carriers, not sufferers. Daughters would be fine. Then Alexei was born, and within weeks the bleeding from his navel would not stop. One historian who has studied this period described Alexandra's state of mind after the diagnosis as a kind of permanent suppressed crisis, one that she managed outwardly with remarkable self-control, and one that she carried inwardly every single day of the rest of her life. Because here is what her days actually looked like. Alexei's condition was managed through a regime of extraordinary vigilance. He could not play as other boys played. A bruise on an ordinary child is an inconvenience. A bruise on Alexei could mean days of internal bleeding, swelling so severe it paralyzed his limbs, pain so intense that his lady-in-waiting once wrote that they had to close their ears to the sound of his screaming, and they still could not shut it out. The servants who carried him, because there were stretches where he couldn't walk at all, did so with a careful, practiced tenderness that speaks to how well they understood the stakes. His tutor Pierre Gilliard kept meticulous notes. He wrote of a child who was in his good periods bright and funny and mischievous, and full of the particular energy of a boy who has not quite accepted that the world wants him to sit still, and who was in his bad periods simply a small person in agony. Can I ask you something personal for a moment? Have you ever had to watch someone you love in pain that you could not stop? That particular helplessness, the kind that sits in your chest and does not move, no matter what you do, is something every parent who has ever sat at a child's bedside will recognize. Now imagine living inside that helplessness not for a week or a month, but for years. Imagine that every morning when your child wakes up, the first thing you do before anything else is watch for signs. Is he moving normally? Is that a bruise? Is he protecting that arm that was Alexandra's life? Every day, for the entire reign. The secret, as we have mentioned, was maintained with extraordinary discipline. The Russian people were not told. The court mostly was not told. The few who knew were bound to silence. And the reason was straightforward and political in Russia. Succession flowed through the male line, and a Tsar whose only son and heir was known to be dangerously ill, permanently, incurably ill with no treatment in existence that could reliably manage the condition, was a Tsar whose dynasty looked vulnerable. Not just emotionally, politically. Other powers, foreign and domestic, could use that vulnerability. So the secret held, and the holding of it cost Alexandra something, because every time the public saw her at an event and noted that she looked pale, looked tired, looked tightly wound, every time the court whispered that she was cold or remote or difficult, she could not explain herself. She could not say, "My son might not survive the week." She could not say, "I have not slept more than a few hours because he cried through the night." She stood there and absorbed the judgment of people who were working with perhaps a tenth of the information they would have needed to understand her. Now let us talk about Spala. October 1912. The imperial family is on holiday at a hunting lodge in Poland. Alexei is 8 years old. He goes rowing. In the boat he shifts his weight badly and takes a knock, not a hard one, not the kind of knock that would make most children do anything more than wince. But Alexei is not most children. The internal bruising that results triggers a cascade. Within a few days he cannot walk. His leg and abdomen are swelling with accumulated blood. The pain, by the accounts of everyone present, is beyond description. For 11 days Alexandra does not sleep. She sits with Alexei. She holds his hand. She watches the doctors hover and consult and offer nothing useful, because there is nothing useful to offer. Draft announcements of the boy's death are prepared. A priest is brought to administer the last rites. Alexandra, by every account, has entered a state beyond ordinary exhaustion, a place where the human body is simply running on something beyond rational resource, kept upright by love and desperation, and nothing else. Then her closest friend Anna Virubova sends a telegram to Siberia, to a man named Grigory Rasputin. The telegram asks him to pray for Alexei. Rasputin's reply comes back within hours. It says, in effect, "Do not fear, the boy will not die." The following day, Alexei begins to recover. Now I want to stop here and think through this carefully with you, because what happened at Spala is genuinely one of the most discussed and disputed moments in this entire story. Was it coincidence? Was it the natural arc of the bleeding episode reaching its end as such episodes sometimes did? Was it, as many modern medical historians believe, the result of a particularly significant intervention, namely that Rasputin had advised Alexandra to dismiss the court physicians who'd been giving Alexei aspirin for the pain, aspirin, which, as we now know, though almost nobody understood this in 1912 because the anticoagulant properties of aspirin were not formally identified until 1971, aspirin significantly impairs blood clotting. The doctors trying to manage Alexei's pain were inadvertently making his bleeding worse. When Rasputin effectively said, "Stop the treatments, stop the medications, trust in God, and let the boy rest," the aspirin stopped. And without the aspirin working against the blood's attempts to clot, Alexei began to stabilize. Does that mean Rasputin knew about the aspirin problem? Almost certainly not. Does it mean the recovery was a miracle? Medical science would say no. Does it mean that Rasputin was entirely without effect, a charlatan whose influence was purely psychological and political? That is harder to say, because there is also the hypnosis theory. Several witnesses described Rasputin as having an extraordinary ability to calm Alexei, to speak softly to the boy, to describe his homeland in Siberia, to bring the child's fear and pain response down in ways that the court physicians, with their clinical manner and their frightened eyes, could not. And stress, as any modern physician will confirm, does worsen bleeding episodes in haemophilia. Relaxation genuinely helps. A calm child bleeds less readily than a terrified one. Rasputin, whatever his many and considerable moral failures in other areas of his life, seems to have had a genuine ability to make Alexei feel safe. That ability and what it meant to Alexandra is the key to everything that follows. Because after Spala she was his completely. Not romantically, not politically, not in any of the ways the rumours would later suggest, but in the only way that mattered to her personally. He had been there when the doctors had nothing left to offer. He had told her the boy would live, and the boy had lived. In Alexandra's framework, the framework of a woman whose faith was not abstract but visceral, immediate, deeply personal, this was not coincidence. This was God. Working through an unlikely instrument, yes. A coarse, barely educated Siberian peasant, yes, but God nonetheless. And you do not dismiss the instrument through which God saved your child. I want to be honest with you about something. The story of Rasputin's influence is one that history has for over a century used to make Alexandra look foolish, credulous, weak-minded. I think that reading misses the point entirely. What Alexandra did, turning to the one person who seemed to be able to help her son when everything else had failed, is what any parent in her position would do, what any of us would do. The rational calculus of a mother watching her child in agony is not the same as the rational calculus of a political strategist. She was not trying to run an empire in those moments. She was trying to keep her boy alive. The tragedy, and it is a real and terrible tragedy, is that the political and the personal were not separable. They were the same life, and the decision she made in the sick room at Spala, the decision to trust Rasputin above the advice of everyone else around her, had consequences that rippled far beyond that room, far beyond that boy, far beyond that year. And here is what I keep coming back to, sitting with this story. If haemophilia B had been treatable in 1904, and today it is entirely treatable, it is managed with a clotting factor replacement that most patients take routinely, and that allows them to live full, unrestricted lives. Alexei would have been fine. He would have grown up and become Tsar. Rasputin would never have entered the palace. The political decisions that Alexandra made under Rasputin's influence, the decisions that outraged the court and alienated the ministers, and eventually contributed to the conditions that made revolution not just possible, but inevitable. None of them would have happened. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Robert Massey, who wrote the definitive account of Nicholas and Alexandra, put it this way. One of the revolutionary leaders, Kerensky, once said, "If there had been no Rasputin, there would have been no Lenin." And Massey, drawing the line back further, wrote simply, "If there had been no haemophilia, there would have been no Rasputin." One mutation, one chromosome, one spontaneous error in the biology of a woman who died in 1891, having spent her whole life not knowing it was there. And the thread from that error to the basement in Yekaterinburg on the 17th of July 1918 is unbroken. The shadow Rasputin cast over the Romanov family was long and complicated and genuinely hard to untangle even now. What he actually did versus what people believed he did. What Alexandra felt versus what the court saw. What he was the real man with his real history and his real character versus the myth that grew up around him like a fever. That is a story that reaches into the deepest parts of this whole tragedy, and it is waiting for you now. Let me tell you what Grigory Rasputin actually looked like before any of the mythology, before any of the legends. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His hair was long, dark, and in almost every contemporary account not conspicuously clean. He had a rough peasant's hands and the kind of walk that belongs to someone who has covered a lot of ground on foot, across a lot of terrain that did not particularly want to be crossed. He came from Pokrovskoye, a small village in western Siberia, the kind of place that 19th century Russia had many thousands of, and that the world outside had no particular reason to think about. His actual surname was Novik. The name he became known by Rasputin was a nickname. In Russian, Rasputstvo means something close to debauchery, and his neighbours gave it to him, which tells you something about what he was like before the religious transformation, which tells you also that there was genuinely a transformation. Around 1897, Rasputin went on a pilgrimage to a monastery at Verkhoturye. He came back different. People who had known him since childhood said they barely recognized him. The restless, dissolute young man who had earned his nickname with such reliable consistency had been replaced by something quieter, more intense, more inward. He spoke about God with the directness that unsettled people. Not the polished language of the seminary, something rawer than that, more personal. He had by his own account experienced something during that pilgrimage that reorganized him from the inside out. Whether you believe that account depends, I think, on how you read his later life, whether the spiritual experience was real, and the dissolute behaviour that continued alongside it was a corruption of something genuine, or whether the spiritual performance was always from the beginning a more sophisticated version of the same opportunism. I honestly do not know, and I think the honest answer is that nobody does. What is certain is that by the time Rasputin arrived in St. Petersburg in 1903, he had developed something that the court circles of the capital were not prepared for. St. Petersburg in 1903 was a city in a peculiar kind of spiritual ferment. The aristocracy had money, it had leisure, it had an increasingly unsatisfied hunger for something that the Orthodox Church, in its established formal state-managed version, was not providing. Mysticism was fashionable, seances were fashionable. Holy men and wandering spiritual figures, straniki, the Russian word for pilgrims, who held no official church position, had a certain glamour in drawing rooms that would have been impossible in an earlier era. And then Rasputin walked in, filthy, unkempt, smelling of the road, with eyes that every single person who encountered him described in almost identical terms: extraordinary, intense, impossible to look away from. The society ladies of St. Petersburg were, to put it plainly, riveted. He was introduced to the royal family in November of 1905. Nicholas wrote in his diary that day with characteristic understatement that they had come to know a man of God, Grigory, from Tobolsk province. That is all. That is the entire diary entry about the man who would over the next 11 years become the single most controversial figure in the empire, a man of God from Tobolsk province. Now, here is where I want to separate the real story from the version that most people carry around in their heads. Because the popular image of Rasputin, the dark sorcerer pulling strings, the mad monk secretly running Russia from behind the curtain, the man having a romantic relationship with the Empress, is almost entirely mythology, constructed partly by his enemies, partly by the revolutionary press, and partly by the natural human tendency to build monsters out of things we cannot explain. The reality is more interesting and more complicated. Was Rasputin a holy man in the conventional sense? No. Almost certainly not. His behaviour outside the palace, the drinking the women, the taking of bribes for court appointments, is too well documented to dismiss. He was by multiple accounts coarse in his manner, indifferent to the opinions of those who considered themselves his social betters, and utterly convinced of his own access to divine favour. The combination of genuine spiritual intensity and very human vices in the same person is unusual enough to be striking. But it is not impossible. Religious history is full of such contradictions, and I do not think they cancel each other out as neatly as people sometimes want them to. Did he have a romantic relationship with Alexandra? No. The evidence for this, which was everywhere in the gossip of the time, is essentially non-existent. Alexandra's letters to Rasputin which survive are intimate in the spiritual sense, the kind of intimacy you have with a confessor, with a priest, with someone who has seen you at your most frightened and vulnerable and has not looked away. They are not love letters. They are the letters of a woman who calls him our friend, because he is the only person in her world who seems able to do what the doctors cannot. The rumours of an affair were spread primarily by people who needed a simple explanation for her trust in him, and a simple explanation was more useful to them than a true one. What Rasputin actually was in the context of Alexandra's life is something more psychologically interesting than any of the myths. He was the person who made her feel in the worst moments that she was not alone with the terror. Think about what that meant to her specifically. Alexandra was a woman who'd been trained by temperament and by upbringing not to show weakness, not to ask for help publicly, not to explain herself to people who would not understand. She carried Alexei's condition in virtual silence. She had almost nobody she could speak to honestly about the weight of it. Her husband loved her and shared her fear, but Nicholas's response to unbearable situations was by his nature to minimize them, to carry on, to not dwell. And Alexandra needed someone who would dwell, who would sit with the fear, who would not look at her and say reassuring things that they did not mean. Rasputin, whatever else he was, did that. He told her the truth as he understood it, even when it was not comforting. He told her the boy would be all right, and when the boy was all right, the faith it created was unshakable. From the court's perspective, from the perspective of the ministers, the Grand Dukes, the senior officers, the people who were supposed to be running the machinery of the empire, the problem was not personal, it was political. Because Rasputin's presence at court became public knowledge, and the public who did not know about Alexei's haemophilia, who had never been told why this Siberian peasant had been allowed into the most private spaces of the imperial family, the public constructed its own explanations. None of them were flattering. And with each year that passed, with each story that circulated through the newspapers, and the dinner tables, and the whispered conversations of St. Petersburg, the damage to the Romanovs' public image accumulated like sediment, quietly, steadily, until the weight of it became significant. The political dimension escalated sharply when World War I began in 1914. Nicholas decided in 1915 to take personal command of the Russian army at the front. This was even at the time widely regarded as an error of strategic proportions. By placing himself at the head of the military, Nicholas tied the Tsar's personal reputation directly to the outcomes of the war. Every defeat became Nicholas's defeat. Every casualty became the Tsar's casualty, and the Russian army was suffering extraordinary casualties. The scale of loss in the first years of the war was almost beyond comprehension. Russia lost somewhere between 1 and 2 million men dead in 1914 and 1915 alone. With Nicholas at the front, Alexandra was left in charge of domestic affairs in Petrograd. And with Alexandra in charge of domestic affairs, Rasputin's influence on government, which had always been a presence, became fully visibly operational. In the 17 or so months that Alexandra was effectively directing policy, there were 4 prime ministers, 5 interior ministers. The cycle of appointments and dismissals came to be called by the people watching it with mounting alarm the ministerial leapfrog. Ministers who questioned Rasputin's role were removed. Ministers who Rasputin approved of, sometimes for reasons that had more to do with their willingness to support him than their competence to govern, were elevated. Alexandra's letters to Nicholas from this period are extraordinary documents. In December of 1916 she wrote, "He entreats you to be firm, to be the master, and not always to give in. Russia wants to feel the whip, it is their nature. We must give a strong country to baby and dare not be weak for his sake." Read that again. She was not writing from cruelty. She was writing from terror. Baby is Alexei. The entire political philosophy in that letter, the autocracy, the iron hand, the rejection of constitutional reform, is filtered through a mother's fear that if the dynasty weakens, her son inherits nothing. Her political instincts were catastrophically wrong, but the emotional root of them was a desperate maternal love. The two things coexist, and I think both of them need to be named. Outside the palace, the situation was accelerating towards something that people could feel without being able to quite name yet. Within the extended Romanov family itself, alarm was reaching desperate levels. Alexandra's own sister, Grand Duchess Elizabeth, travelled to the palace and begged her personally to send Rasputin away. Alexandra refused. Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, a senior member of the family, wrote to the Tsar directly. He wrote, "You believe Alexandra, that is understandable, but what comes out of her mouth is the result of a clever manipulation and not the real truth. If you could eliminate this constant intrusion of these dark forces into all affairs, the revival of Russia would immediately begin." Nicholas read the letter. He did not act on it. The people who eventually acted were not politicians, they were noblemen. Prince Felix Yusupov was the richest man in Russia, married to the Tsar's niece. He had been watching for years, and he had, with a kind of aristocratic logic that has its own terrible consistency, concluded that the only way to save the monarchy was to remove the man they believed was destroying it from within. On the night of the 29th of December 1916, Rasputin was lured to Yusupov's palace on the pretext of meeting the prince's wife, Irina. What happened next has been so thoroughly embellished by everyone involved that the actual sequence of events is genuinely difficult to reconstruct. The story most people know, the poison that did not work, the shooting, the drowning, is part fact and considerable legend. What is documented: Rasputin was taken to Yusupov's palace. He did not leave alive. His body was found in the Neva River. The cause of death was drowning. Alexandra wrote to Nicholas the same night, still not knowing what had happened. Her letter says, with an anguish that is almost unbearable to read, "Our friend has disappeared." And then she describes what little she knows, that a car had come for him, that there had been shooting heard at Yusupov's house, that police were searching, and underneath the frantic details in the space between the words, you can feel the thing she already knows, but cannot yet bring herself to say. The conspirators had hoped that removing Rasputin would rescue the monarchy, that it would clear the air. Reset the story. Give Nicholas a chance to reform, to reach out to the Duma, to build back the trust the court had hemorrhaged over years. It did none of those things. The revolution came anyway, 11 weeks later, and here is the final, strange, genuinely unsettling thing about Rasputin's story. He had predicted it. In a letter written before his death, a letter that was found afterward, and that historians have debated ever since regarding exactly when it was composed, and whether it was written as prophecy or as a piece of carefully staged theatre, he wrote to Nicholas, "If I am killed by common assassins, and especially by my brothers, the Russian peasants, you Tsar of Russia, have nothing to fear. But if I am killed by the nobility, by boyars, by those close to you, then you will not survive me by long." The men who killed Rasputin were precisely the nobility. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich was the Tsar's first cousin. Prince Yusupov was married into the family. Rasputin was gone by the 30th of December 1916. The dynasty was gone by the 15th of March 1917. Whether that letter was genuine prophecy, clever calculation, or an extraordinary coincidence, I leave entirely to you. What I will say is this. The story of Rasputin and Alexandra is not at its core a story about a mystic and a credulous woman. It is a story about a mother and a sick child and the impossible intersection of private grief with public power. It is a story about how the things we keep secret to protect the people we love can become the very things that make us vulnerable to the people who wish us harm. The secret of Alexei's haemophilia was kept to protect the dynasty, and it gave Rasputin a permanent room inside the palace that no one else could claim and no one else could close. The women of the Romanov family were not passive in any of this. The 4 daughters of Nicholas and Alexandra were growing up through all of it, through the secrecy, through the whispers, through the years of war that were pressing in on the walls of their world like weather against old glass, and they were in their own ways far more extraordinary than history usually makes space for. Their story is where we are going next. Pull back from the politics for a moment, from the war, from the mysticism, from the court intrigues and the whispered scandals and all the weight of empire pressing down on those palace walls. Because living inside all of that, right at the centre of it, breathing the same air, eating at the same table, sleeping a few doors down the hall were 4 girls. Just 4 girls, who happened to share the most famous surname in Russia, and who happened to be photographed more than almost any other young women of their generation, and who have for over 100 years been remembered primarily as a single unit. 4 daughters, the royal princesses, the tragic sisters. But they were not a unit. They were 4 entirely different people who loved each other the way people only love someone they were thrown together with before either of them had any choice in the matter, which is to say completely irritably loyally and without the option of doing it any other way. Their collective nickname was OTMA. They invented it themselves. The first letter of each name in age order, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia. They used it to sign letters together when they were writing as a group, which, given that they spent the vast majority of their lives in each other's constant company, was quite often. They were divided by their own reckoning into 2 pairs. Olga and Tatiana were the big pair 2 years apart in age, sharing a bedroom dressing alike, moving through the world as a unit within the unit. Maria and Anastasia were the little pair, the younger ones, 18 months apart, also sharing a room, also frequently inseparable. And then all 4 together, tumbling through the corridors of the Alexander Palace, trailed by a small collection of dogs, leaving behind them the particular kind of disorder that only 4 children who've been in the same space for too long can generate. Now, before we go any further into who they were, I want to tell you something about how they were raised, because it surprises almost everyone who hears it. These were the daughters of the last Emperor of Russia, Imperial Highnesses, Grand Duchesses, Girls who received jewelled gift from European royals as a matter of routine, who had summer palaces and a private yacht and everything that the phrase most powerful family in the world implies. And they slept on plain iron cots. They bathed in cold water every morning. They wore hand-me-down clothes. They were not given extravagant allowances. They did their own chores. Alexandra had been raised under Queen Victoria's particular brand of English sensibility, the kind that regards physical comfort as faintly morally suspicious, and believes that useful habits should be instilled early. And so the children of the Russian imperial family woke each morning to cold baths and simple food, and the expectation that they would behave whatever else was happening in the empire outside like reasonably decent human beings. The result by most accounts was 4 girls who were astonishingly easy to like. Their tutors and governesses left behind dozens of accounts of them. What strikes me reading through those accounts is how consistent the picture is across different sources, different years, different perspectives. These were not children performing graciousness for the cameras. They were, and this word comes up again and again, genuinely warm, pert, friendly, curious, devoted to each other and to their parents, utterly uninterested in pretension. So let me introduce them to you properly, one at a time, the way they deserve. Olga, born on the 15th of November 1895. The eldest, the one who arrived in a country that had been waiting for a boy and got a girl to what one can only describe as Russia-wide disappointment. Nicholas and Alexandra were not disappointed. They were delighted, and Olga grew up knowing she was loved, which did something good for her. She had her father's colouring lighter hair, a certain softness in the features, and her mother's emotional intensity, which she spent her whole life trying to manage with varying success. She was, by the accounts of everyone who knew her, the most intellectually gifted of the 4 sisters. Her tutors described her as having a remarkably quick brain. She read voraciously. She wrote poetry, real poetry, the kind that circulated privately among people who genuinely thought it was good, not the well-intentioned scribblings that get politely praised because of whose daughter you are. She was funny in an understated, dry way. She was also, and this mattered, deeply sensitive. She felt things acutely. The gap between the world she wanted and the world she lived in was one she was aware of, and it wore on her. By the time the war came, Olga was nursing wounded soldiers and falling quietly in love with junior officers who could never, by the rules of their world, be anything more to her than the men she sat beside in a hospital ward. She knew it. She grieved it. Her diary in those years grows progressively heavier. Tatiana, second born, June of 1897. Where Olga was all emotional weather, Tatiana was still water. She was by unanimous agreement the most beautiful of the 4. Tall, dark-haired, with an elegance of bearing that one contemporary described as the most aristocratic in appearance of any of the sisters. She had inherited her mother's reserve, and unlike Alexandra, who was so often misread by the world around her, Tatiana somehow managed to deploy that reserve as authority rather than coldness. Her siblings called her the governess, not as an insult, as a statement of fact. Tatiana was the one they sent as their representative when they wanted something from their parents. She was practical in a way that in different circumstances might have made her a genuinely formidable administrator. She organized. She got things done. During the war, when she trained as a Red Cross nurse alongside her mother and Olga, she was described by the doctors as the most skilled of the 3 precise, steady-handed, capable of holding herself together in situations that were, by any normal measure, extremely difficult to hold oneself together in. She was closest to Alexandra of all the daughters. They understood each other's reserve the way people understand a shared language. Maria, third daughter, born June of 1899. Maria was the one who makes me smile every time I read about her. because she was so completely specifically herself. Broadly built, people said with large blue eyes that her family called Marie's saucers, which is both slightly unkind and also clearly said with affection. She was warm in the uncomplicated way that some people simply are. She loved soldiers, specifically and enthusiastically. Her childhood nanny recorded a moment when little Maria looked out of the window at a regiment marching past and announced, "Oh, I love those dear soldiers. I should like to kiss them all." She was, one imagines, 5 years old at the time. Nothing about her grew out of that impulse. She wanted a simple life. She wanted to fall in love with someone good and be loved back and have children, and not have to worry too much about the weight of history. She did not get that, but she wanted it with a completeness and clarity that is honestly rather moving. Lord Mountbatten, who was a distant cousin of the sisters, and met them briefly as a small boy, kept a photograph of Maria beside his bed until his death. He had, he said, been completely besotted with her. Given what we know about Maria, I believe it entirely. And then there was Anastasia, born June of 1901, the youngest, the one who somehow became more famous than any of the others, partly because of the mystery that surrounded her for most of the 20th century. Partly because of the animated film, which I am aware has introduced her to approximately 3 generations of children who are then shocked to find out the real story. But mostly, I think, because even from the historical record, even from the letters and the photographs and the second-hand accounts, you can feel her. She jumps off the page. She was, as everyone agreed, the family clown, short and sturdy with blue eyes and strawberry blonde hair. Her aunt gave her the nickname Schwibzik, a Russian corruption of a German word meaning something close to little mischief. Her tutors described her as the fastest learner of all 4 sisters, and simultaneously the most resistant to the actual process of learning. She was bored by schoolwork and brilliant at everything she did not put effort into, which is the particular combination that makes certain children absolutely maddening for their teachers. She hid rocks inside snowballs. She climbed trees to avoid lessons. She put on impromptu theatrical performances in which she was always without negotiation the star. She made her family laugh in ways that nobody else could, including her mother, especially her mother, and anyone who has ever met someone with the particular gift for making a reserved, sad person genuinely helplessly laugh knows exactly how rare and valuable that gift is. Here is a small detail that I keep coming back to. The 4 sisters were allowed perfumed baths in the evening. Olga's preferred scent was rose tea. Tatiana's was jasmine de course, and they all shared bedrooms in pairs, the big pair together, the little pair together, not because the palace lacked space, but because their mother had decided this was how children should be raised. Close together, in shared space, learning the ordinary accommodations that human beings have to make for one another. There is something very intentional about that. What they all shared, beyond the shared rooms and the shared nicknames and the shared cold baths and the shared devotion to each other, was a particular quality of attention. They noticed people. When they were visited in childhood by guests, the accounts suggest they were the kind of children who actually looked at you, who asked follow-up questions, who remembered what you had said the last time, who made you feel against all logic, like you were the most interesting person in whatever room they were in, which is a quality I would argue that you either are born with or you develop from being genuinely loved. These children were genuinely loved, but, and there is always a but in this story, their lives, for all the warmth inside them, were bounded in a way that was unusual, even for royal children of their era. Alexandra's deep anxiety about Alexei's condition, about exposing the children to the wider world, to risk, to the germs and crowds and unpredictability of ordinary public life, meant that they were kept to a degree that even sympathetic observers found striking close. Too close. The court functions they attended were few. The balls were rare. They sailed in summer on the imperial yacht, they spent time at the palace in Crimea. They had a life that was comfortable and full of love. But it was a life whose boundaries were drawn tightly around the family. And within those boundaries they grew up knowing almost nothing about the country that bore their name. Have you ever thought about what it would be like to grow up behind glass, to see things, to see people, to see ordinary life going by outside, but to never quite be part of it? The four sisters understood this about themselves. Their governess recorded Anastasia and Maria regularly peppering wounded soldiers with questions about ordinary life, what their homes were like, what they ate for dinner, whether they had dogs. They called it the outside life, as if the world they lived in and the world most people inhabited were simply two different things with a very visible line between them, and they knew which side of the line they were on. The photographs that survive from this period are genuinely beautiful. There are thousands of them. The family was passionate about photography in an era when photography was still a kind of miracle. And in image after image, informal images, the kind you take when you're not performing for anyone you see them. Olga with a book, Tatiana looking sideways at something off camera, with an expression that manages to convey both warmth and mild judgment simultaneously, Maria laughing with her whole face, Anastasia making absolutely deranged faces at the camera with the air of someone who's been doing this since before the photographer even set up the equipment. All four of them tangled together on a blanket somewhere sunny, the kind of image that makes you forget for a moment what you already know, and then you remember. And that is the particular kind of grief this story carries, not the grief of distance, the grief of proximity. These were not abstractions. These were people with specific perfume preferences and dogs with names, and a complicated relationship with the fact that Anastasia cheated at snowball fights. They were real, completely specifically, irreducibly real. The war changed everything for them, in ways that were by any measure both devastating and quietly extraordinary. Because when the war came in 1914, and the wounded soldiers began arriving by the thousands in hospitals around Tsarskoye, Selo Olga and Tatiana took off the Grand Duchess dresses and put on nurse uniforms, white aprons, practical shoes, and they went to work. Not as figureheads, not as charitable patrons sitting decorously at bedsides with flowers, as nurses, trained practicing hands-on nurses, assisting in surgeries, changing dressings on wounds that were not decorative, holding the hands of young men who were frightened and far from home. And we will go into that world more deeply very soon because it is one of the most extraordinary chapters in their story. For now, what I want you to carry from this is something simple. These four girls built a world between them that was in its own modest and private way remarkable, not because of what they were born into, but because of who they chose to be inside it. They could have been cold, they could have been distant, they could have leaned into the untouchable formality that the situation practically demanded. Instead, they were warm, they were funny, they were curious, they were honest with each other in the particular way that people are only honest with the people they are utterly sure of, and they chose consistently and apparently without much effort to see the people in front of them, even when the people in front of them were soldiers who had lost limbs, even when the people in front of them were guards who were holding them captive. Even then, that quality of attention, that persistent, almost stubborn capacity for genuine human connection in conditions designed to discourage it, is, I think, the thing worth remembering about these four sisters. Not the tragedy. This. The war that brought Olga and Tatiana into those hospital wards in 1914 also brought them face to face for the first time really with what Russia actually was. Not the country of palaces and imperial ceremonies, the country of ordinary people in pain, far from home, dying in numbers that the human mind struggles to hold. What they saw there, what it did to them. That is the next chapter in their story, and it is one I find genuinely hard to look away from. August 1914. The war arrives like weather. Not suddenly, it had been building for months. Anyone paying attention could feel it. But when it finally broke over Europe, it had the quality of something that had been waiting a long time to happen, and now simply was. Russia mobilized. Nicholas left for the front. And inside the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, Alexandra made a decision that surprised almost everyone who heard about it. She was going to become a nurse, not a patron, not a ceremonial figurehead who appeared in photographs at hospital fundraising events, a working trained practicing nurse. And so were Olga and Tatiana. I want you to pause on this for a moment because I think we tend to absorb this fact too quickly without really sitting with what it meant. Alexandra Feodorovna was the Empress of Russia. She had spent the previous 20 years being criticized for her remoteness, her German origins, her failure to circulate through court society, with the warmth that Maria Feodorovna had made look effortless. She could have responded to the war in 100 ways that required no personal risk and no personal discomfort. She could have signed her name to charitable committees, raised money, appeared at formal occasions in appropriate mourning colours, and been entirely correct in doing so. Instead, she enrolled in nursing training, and she made her 2 eldest daughters, aged 18 and 16, do the same. The hospital was set up in the Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo. The building, which had been designed for imperial splendour, now had its grand rooms converted. Where there had been gilded furniture and painted ceilings and all the formal machinery of aristocratic display, there were now hospital beds, rows of them, and in those beds, arriving in a continuous stream from the front, were the young men of Russia. Alexandra and her daughters trained properly. They completed the required Red Cross nursing course. They learned bandaging, wound care, post-operative assistance. They were not taught theory, and then moved to supervisory roles the way most women of their class would have been. They were put to work. Let me tell you what Olga saw on her first day assisting in surgery. She was 19 years old. She had grown up in a palace. Her entire life to that point, in terms of genuine exposure to human suffering, had been conducted at a careful distance. Alexi's illness, the significant exception, and that was the suffering of someone she loved rather than a stranger. Now she stood in a room where the operating table was occupied by a man with a bullet wound. She assisted. She held instruments. She watched. And she came out of that room and was sick. This is not a detail people usually include in accounts of the Romanov princesses, but it is documented. Because Olga did not pretend it hadn't happened. She wrote about it. She was sick, and then she went back the next day. That matters to me. Not the nausea that is just a physical fact about what happens when an unprepared human being walks into a surgical theatre. What matters is the going back. Nobody required her to go back. Nobody would have said anything if she'd decided that this particular form of service was not suited to her constitution. She went back because she had decided at 19 years old that this was the work she wanted to do. Tatiana, by contrast, took to nursing with an ease that stunned people. Historian Helen Rappaport, who has studied the Romanov sisters more thoroughly than perhaps anyone alive, wrote that Tatiana had given a different history the talent to have been a pioneer of women's nursing. She was precise. She was calm. She did not flinch. In April of 1917, after the revolution had already begun, and the family was under house arrest and Tatiana could no longer go to the hospital, she wrote a letter to the head nurse, a woman named Chebotaryova, who had become someone she trusted. The letter says, "I am sad that now that I am well again, I cannot work in the hospital. It is so strange to be at home in the mornings not doing the bandaging. Who is doing that now? That is not the sentiment of someone performing public service. That is the sentence of someone who misses her work." Maria and Anastasia, who were 13 and 12 when the war began, and too young to be formally certified as Red Cross nurses, were assigned to what was called morale work. which sounds considerably less demanding than it was. They visited the wards, they talked to the soldiers, they asked them questions about their lives, where they came from, what their families were like, what they ate at home, whether they had dogs. For the sisters, these conversations were extraordinary. Remember what we discussed about the outside life, the world they had always been kept slightly apart from that they could see, but not quite touch. Suddenly it was in the same room with them, in every bed, speaking in accents from every corner of Russia, telling them things they had never been told. Maria in particular threw herself into these conversations. She had always been the one who connected most easily with people she had never met. Now she had hundreds of them, and she approached each one with an openness that the soldiers, many of whom had never in their lives expected to be spoken to this way, by anyone with her title, found genuinely disarming. There is a quality that all four sisters demonstrated in those hospital wards that I want to name properly, because I think it is easy to describe what they did there, bandages, conversations, morale building, and miss what it actually required of them. It required them to see, not to manage, not to maintain a careful emotional distance behind professional courtesy, to actually look at the person in front of them, a young man from a village in Siberia, another from the suburbs of Moscow, men who are frightened and far from home and in pain, in the particular way that war produces physical pain, yes, but also the deeper kind that comes from having seen things that the mind does not know how to file away. The Romanov sisters sat with those men. They listened, not because it was required, because they wanted to know, and the soldiers by every account felt it. But the war also did something to the sisters that is harder to talk about, because alongside the expansion, the opening up to reality, the discovery of genuine purpose, there was damage, particularly for Olga. The war as Rappaport documents broke something in her. Not all at once. Slowly. The accumulated weight of the wounded and the dying and the men she cared for who were sent back to the front and did not come back from it. The accumulated frustration of falling in love quietly, privately, completely with men she could never be with. Olga fell for an officer named Pavel Voronov while nursing him. He recovered. He left. He became engaged to someone else. She fell for another, a cavalry officer she called Golden Mitya in her diary. He recovered. He left. And she was 19 and 20 and 21 and still living inside the same palace walls, and still forbidden from the ordinary life she wanted more than almost anything else. She'd once told her parents that all she wanted, all she had ever wanted, was to marry a Russian and live quietly somewhere in the countryside. Not a dynasty, not a throne, just a house somewhere green and someone to come home to. By 1915, Olga was in such emotional distress that her doctors were giving her arsenic injections to manage her depression. Arsenic injections, which is what passed for psychiatric treatment in 1915. And she continued to function, continued to show up, because the alternative was not showing up at all, and that was not something Olga was capable of. I want to stop here and ask you something directly. When you picture the women of an imperial family in wartime, in any era, what do you picture? The formal portraits, the public appearances, the carefully staged photographs that communicate stability and grace to a watching public. That is what most dynasties gave their people. What these women gave was something considerably less photogenic and considerably more real. Alexandra herself, who was genuinely unwell through much of this period, her heart condition worsening, her legs swelling so badly that she sometimes needed a wheelchair to move between rooms, pushed herself to nurse alongside her daughters. She sat with men in pain and held their hands and told them they were not alone. And she did this while being called the German woman in the streets of Petrograd, while being accused of spying for the enemy because of the country she was born in. While the court whispered about her and the newspapers implied treachery, she kept going. There is one particular detail from this period that I cannot let pass without telling you, because it is simultaneously very sad and very funny in the way that the best true stories often are. At some point during the war, all 4 sisters came down with measles. The medication they were given to treat it had a side effect. It caused their hair to fall out. All of it. All 4 of them. And so the Grand Duchesses of Russia, daughters of the Tsar, had their heads shaved. Completely bald. For a while they wore scarves, and then they stopped. They had apparently decided that they could not be bothered with the maintenance of dignity on top of everything else they were managing. They walked around the palace bald and apparently entirely comfortable with it, which tells you really more about who they were than almost anything else. The war also placed them in a social world they had never navigated before. For the first time, the sisters were in sustained daily contact with people who were not staff, not family, not the carefully vetted circle their mother had always controlled. And into that new social world walked a succession of officers who were by multiple contemporary accounts quite attractive, and who were finding themselves in daily close proximity to 4 charming, curious, warm young women who happened to be the daughters of the Tsar. Olga's diary from this period reads in places like a young woman's diary anywhere. The noticing, the hoping, the careful recording of small gestures that might mean something. Tatiana attracted admirers so persistently that Alexandra, who had eyes for exactly this sort of thing, wrote to Nicholas at the front that one of the officers seemed like he might be, as she put it, a perfect son-in-law. Nothing came of any of it. It couldn't. The dynasty's requirements for their marriages were as fixed and immovable as anything in the palace. They were expected to marry into other royal houses, not officers, however charming, not Russians of good family, but ordinary birth. The dynasties of Europe, and the dynasties of Europe by 1915 were being systematically destroyed by the same war that was filling the hospital wards at Tsarskoye Selo. There was nowhere to go, no path toward the ordinary life. I find myself thinking about them often in this period of the story. 4 young women going about the most human and decent work imaginable, holding hands in the dark with strangers, asking questions because they genuinely wanted to know the answers, learning slowly and at close range what Russia actually was. Not the ceremonies, not the palaces, the people, and falling in love with those people in the various ways people fall in love with individuals, with ideas, with the texture of ordinary life that had always been just out of reach. And then going back to their rooms in the palace and changing back into their court clothes and being Grand Duchesses again. The contrast between what they saw every morning in the hospital and what waited for them every evening in the palace was widening month by month. The war was not going well. The numbers of dead were staggering. The country was beginning very quietly to crack. And the family whose name was on everything, whose faces were on the stamps, whose portraits hung in the post offices and the government buildings and the railway stations, was sitting together in a palace at Tsarskoye Selo, trying to figure out how to hold on. The last good season before winter is always the most beautiful, and for the Romanov women the winter was almost here. The year 1916 does not announce itself as the last good year. That is the nature of last good years. They do not come with a label. They arrive the same way all years do, quietly in the grey light of January, and they pass through the seasons doing the things years do, and only afterward, looking back, do you understand what they were. For the Romanov women, the winter of 1916 into early 1917 was that year. The last one where the structure they had built their entire lives around was still just barely standing. Picture Tsarskoye Selo in winter, 25 kilometers south of Petrograd. The Alexander Palace sitting inside its park, snow on every surface, the trees bare and geometrically perfect, against a sky that turns white by early afternoon and stays white well into the following morning. Inside the palace, the lamps were lit by 3 o'clock. There was tea. There was music. Alexandra played the piano badly but persistently, and the girls had varying degrees of musical talent that they exercised with varying degrees of enthusiasm. There were books and letters, and the endless, intimate, small business of family life. The children were recovering from measles. Alexei's health was uncertain, as it always was. Alexandra was unwell herself, moving between her chair and her wheelchair, and her bed with the careful economy of someone who has learned to ration physical effort across the hours of a long day. Nicholas was at the front writing daily letters home that were full of concern for his children's health and descriptions of the weather, and 25 kilometers away Petrograd was starving, not dramatically starving, not yet. But the bread lines had been lengthening since the autumn. The price of food had risen steadily throughout the war, until by the end of 1916 it stood at roughly 4 times what it had been in 1914. Factory workers were earning wages that had not kept pace with that rise. 1.5 million Russian soldiers had deserted in 1916 alone. The army that was supposed to represent Russia's strength on the Eastern Front was hemorrhaging men who had simply decided after 2 years of industrial-scale suffering that they did not wish to continue. Here is the thing that makes this period so historically striking, and why I keep wanting to linger inside it before moving to what comes next. The warning signs were not hidden. They were not obscure. The people with the authority to act on them were being told in explicit terms what was happening. In November of 1916, the State Duma Russia's parliament, such as it was, issued a formal warning to Nicholas. They stated directly that unless a constitutional form of government was established, a terrible disaster would grip the country. A terrible disaster would grip the country, not a political inconvenience, not a period of unrest. A disaster. Mikhail Rodzianko, the president of the Duma, had been requesting audiences with Nicholas for months. He had told him in one conversation with the particular desperation of a man who knows he is not being heard. No one opens your eyes to the true role which this man, he meant Rasputin, is playing. The situation cannot continue much longer. Nicholas had received the warning. He had noted it. He had not acted on it, because the person who had the deepest access to Nicholas's ear was Alexandra, and Alexandra, writing from the palace where she was managing 4 sick children and a failing body, and the constant terror about Alexei, was telling her husband something different. She was telling him to be firm, to hold the autocracy, to not give the Duma what it wanted. She used in one letter from December of 1916 a phrase that has haunted historians ever since. She wrote, "Russia wants to feel the whip. It is their nature." She was wrong. She was catastrophically historically wrong, and I think it matters to say that clearly while also saying that she was not writing from cruelty or cynicism. She was writing from fear. Fear for Alexei's inheritance. Fear for the dynasty. Fear that any concession to the Duma was a step toward the dissolution of everything her children would need to survive. She was a woman in the grip of a mother's terror making political judgments, and the judgments were wrong. The two things coexist. They have to. Outside the palace walls, the winter of 1916 was building towards something. The cold was its own kind of pressure. Petrograd winters are not the gentle grey dampness of Western Europe. They are a physical force, the kind of cold that makes standing in a bread line for 3 hours not merely unpleasant but genuinely dangerous. And yet every morning in the working-class districts of the city the lines formed. Women mostly, factory workers, wives of soldiers at the front, standing in temperatures that their bodies were not equipped for, waiting for bread that was rationed and frequently ran out before they reached the front of the line. This detail, this specific domestic, entirely unspectacular detail, of women standing in the cold waiting for bread is, I think, the actual engine of what happened next. Not ideology, not the revolutionary parties who are mostly scattered across Europe in exile, not the grand theories of historical inevitability. Women standing in the cold, waiting for bread that did not come, deciding eventually that this was enough. On the 8th of March 1917, which was International Women's Day, textile workers in the Vyborg district of Petrograd walked off the job. They were not instructed to do this by any party. There was no official strike call. They simply stopped, and then they went into the street. And they called to the workers in other factories to come out and join them, and within a day more than 90,000 workers were on strike across Petrograd. By the 25th of February, that number had reached 200,000. The Bolsheviks incidentally told the women to go home. The women did not go home. Inside the Alexander Palace, 25 kilometers away, the girls were still sick with measles. This is not a metaphor. They actually still had measles. Olga had it worst. She had a high fever and had been confined to bed for days. Tatiana was only slightly better. Alexandra, who was herself unwell and managing her own physical decline while nursing her children, was caught between the domestic emergency of 4 ill children and the political emergency she could hear gathering outside the palace walls. She wrote to Nicholas at the front. Her letters from this period, the final days of the dynasty, are extraordinary documents. They are simultaneously domestic and desperate. She mentions Olga's fever. She mentions the bread lines. She mentions the soldiers in Petrograd who are beginning to refuse orders to fire on protesters. And underlying all of it, threaded through every paragraph like a current of controlled panic, is the sense of a woman who knows something is very wrong and cannot stop it and does not know how to stop it. 2. Nicholas received the letters at his military headquarters in Mogilev. His diary entries from this period are in their own way equally haunting, because they maintain their characteristic quality of mild domestic reportage even as the empire dissolves around them. He notes the weather. He notes what he ate. He notes that he received Rodzianko's telegram warning him that the government was collapsing. And then the diary entry ends. There is something in that ending, the way the diary simply stops registering the magnitude of what is happening and returns to the ordinary, that I find genuinely hard to look away from. Not stupidity, not malice. A man whose entire psychological architecture had been built around the belief that the Tsar's role was to carry on, to project stability, to not show the cracks. He was projecting stability into a diary that nobody would read for another century. The soldiers were the final piece. Nicholas had ordered them to fire on the protesters, and on the 27th of February the Pavlovsky regiment refused. Then other regiments began to refuse. By the end of the day, tens of thousands of soldiers had joined the protesters in the streets. This was the moment that made everything else inevitable. A Tsar without a loyal army is not a Tsar. He is simply a man. Meanwhile, the 4 Grand Duchesses were lying in darkened rooms with high fevers. This too is not a metaphor. Tatiana wrote a letter from her sickbed during those days, one of the few surviving documents from this exact period that is quietly devastating in its ordinariness. She asks about the household. She asks whether a friend has written. She does not mention the revolution, either because she did not know how serious it was, or because she knew and the only way to hold herself together was to write about ordinary things. Here is the part of this story that I find genuinely difficult to sit with. The warnings had been there for years, not hidden, not subtle, spelled out in formal letters by the people whose job it was to read the country for the Tsar. In 1916, one of the Tsar's own relatives, Grand Duke Alexander, wrote to him directly and said that the dynasty was in danger of revolution if nothing changed. The same message came from the Duma, from the army's senior generals, from the extended Romanov family, from foreign ambassadors. Nicholas heard all of it. He did not act. And Alexandra, who had his ear more than any of them, told him to hold firm. I have spent a long time thinking about why, and I do not think the answer is simple. I think Nicholas genuinely believed in the deep structural way that people believe things they have never had to question, that God's will expressed through the Tsar was the organizing principle of Russia. To reform was in that framework to betray a divine mandate. And Alexandra reinforced that belief not because she was calculating, but because she believed it too. Two people in a closed room confirming each other's certainties. While outside the window the bread lines grew, on the 2nd of March 1917 Nicholas's train was stopped at Pskov station. He'd been trying to return to Tsarskoye Selo. He could not get through. The railway lines were held by troops who were no longer loyal. At Pskov he met with two emissaries from the Duma, who told him clearly and without softening that his abdication was the only thing that could save the country. Nicholas asked apparently calmly whether a constitutional monarchy might be an alternative. They told him no. He asked whether abdicating in favour of his son Alexei might work. He knew as he asked that Alexei had haemophilia. He knew what it would mean to hand a 13-year-old boy with an incurable bleeding condition to a revolution. He could not do it. He abdicated for himself and for Alexei both. 304 years of Romanov rule ended in a railway carriage, with a pencil, in 20 minutes. At the Alexander Palace, Alexandra did not know it had happened until afterward. She was in the room with her sick children. She was holding cold cloths. She was doing what she had always done when things were bad. She was simply being a mother, and then someone came in and told her. The music had stopped, and the women of the Romanov family, the 4 sick girls in their beds, the Empress Dowager Maria Feodorovna receiving the news in her own palace, Alexandra sitting in the room with her children were now living in a different kind of world. Not the world they'd been prepared for, the other one, the one that had been waiting outside the palace walls for years. What came after the abdication was not at first catastrophic. It felt in its early months almost manageable. House arrest, restricted movement, the loss of servants and privileges, but the family was together. Nicholas came home, and in the strange suspended quiet of that first period of confinement something happened that almost nobody predicted. They found each other, more completely perhaps than they ever had when the weight of empire had been between them. That story of grace under an impossible weight of what people do when everything is taken from them is where we're going next. What stays with me whenever I come back to this particular moment is the geography of it. Think about where everyone was on the night of the 15th of March 1917. Nicholas was in Pskov, a railway siding, a borrowed carriage, in the middle of nowhere, stuck on a track that his own revolution had made impassable. Alexandra was at Tsarskoye Selo, 25 kilometers from Petrograd, in the palace, with 5 sick children and a household that had been quietly falling apart since the breadline started. And Maria Feodorovna, the Empress Dowager, the woman who had arrived in Russia as a Danish princess 50 years earlier and outlasted everything, was in Kiev, running Red Cross operations, reading the same dispatches as everyone else, and drawing from those dispatches conclusions that the other 2 were not yet drawing. 3 women, 3 completely different rooms, and at the centre of all of them the same impossible fact: the dynasty was gone. Nicholas had actually written in his diary in the final days before the abdication a sentence that keeps stopping me when I read it. On the night before he signed the document he wrote, "All around me I see treason, cowardice and deceit." He was describing what he saw as betrayal by his generals, his ministers, the people he had trusted. And the thing is, he was not entirely wrong. His generals had told him one by one that the army could no longer support the throne. His own commander-in-chief had polled the front commanders, and they had all sent back the same message: abdication is the only option. The men he had believed were behind him, they were not behind him. But here is what strikes me about those words treason, cowardice and deceit when I set them beside Nicholas's diary entries from the same week. On the day the protests in Petrograd were first reported to him as serious, he wrote that the weather had been sunny. He'd gone for a walk. He had taken a long drive. The dispatches about 200,000 people in the streets were arriving at headquarters, and Nicholas went for a walk and noted the sunshine. This is not a criticism exactly. This is a portrait of a man whose psychological architecture had been built from childhood to maintain the surface of order regardless of what were happening underneath, who had been trained with absolute thoroughness to project stability, who had no other tools. The abdication itself, as we have said, happened at a railway siding in Pskov at roughly 9 o'clock in the evening. 2 emissaries from the Duma came to his carriage, and Nicholas, before they had finished explaining the situation, interrupted them. He said calmly, "I have decided to renounce my throne today." Just like that. Not a man collapsing, not a man raging. A man who had already made the decision alone in whatever hours of private reckoning the train journey had given him, and was now simply stating it. He signed the document. He asked whether he could include a farewell message to the army. He drafted one. It was later suppressed by the provisional government he had just loyally recommended his troops to follow. He did not know that yet. Now let me take you to Mogilev a few days later, because something happened in Mogilev that is rarely given the attention it deserves. Maria Feodorovna came. She travelled from Kiev to Mogilev specifically to see her son, her deposed son, the former Tsar of Russia, and she stayed with him for 2 days. They had lunch together. They had dinner together. Nicholas's diary records the times of their meetings with his characteristic precision. She arrived, they ate, she stayed until such and such an hour, and then she left. And Nicholas wrote in his diary, "At 4:30 I left her. It nearly broke my heart." Nobody knows what was said in that room. No minutes were kept. No letter survives that describes those conversations with any completeness. What we have is the fact of them. A 70-year-old woman who had watched the Russia she had loved for 50 years come apart, who had in her own way seen this coming for years, who had written in private that Alexandra should be removed from influence, that the path they were on was not survivable, and who was now sitting across a lunch table from her son, the boy she had raised, the man who had been Tsar, the person she had worried about silently and consistently for 23 years of his reign. I think about what that lunch must have felt like. Not the words, the silence between the words, the things two people say when there is nothing left to say that will change anything, and all they can do is remain present with each other for a few more hours. There is something Maria did not do that I think deserves to be named. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not arrive in Mogilev with any of the political anger or the "I warned you" energy that would have been entirely understandable. She came as his mother. She'd written to him once, "You know that my thoughts and prayers never leave you. I think of you day and night, and sometimes feel so sick at heart that I believe I cannot bear it any longer. But God is merciful. He will give us strength for this terrible ordeal." That letter was written during the captivity period, but the woman who wrote it had been that person steady, present, not collapsing for her entire life. Even here, even now, Alexandra's experience of the abdication was entirely different, and I want to describe it carefully because I think it is easy to misread what happened to her. She was at Tsarskoye Selo when the revolution broke around the palace. Guards began deserting. The servants were frightened. The outside world was pressing in with a force that the walls had not been designed to resist, and Alexandra did not know for several days what Nicholas had decided. The communications were disrupted. She was receiving fragments of news, conflicting reports, rumours. She was managing 5 children, managing her own failing health, managing a household that was quietly disintegrating and waiting. When she finally received word that Nicholas had abdicated, she did not collapse. This is important. People who expected her to fall apart were surprised. She was still. She was very quiet. She wrote to Nicholas a letter that survives, and it is one of the most extraordinary documents of the entire period. She writes about the children. She writes about practical arrangements. She signs it, "Your very own wife, Sunny." The same signature, the same name, as if the abdication had changed the political facts but had not touched the thing she was. But beneath that surface, something had shifted irreversibly. Alexandra had defined herself for 23 years as the Empress of Russia, not as a title, as an identity. Every choice she had made, the political positions, the loyalty to Rasputin, the insistence on autocracy, the refusal to bend had been made inside that identity. The wife of the Tsar, the mother of the heir, the defender of the dynasty. Who was she without it? The question was not one she ever asked directly, but you can feel it in the letters and diary entries that survive from the period immediately after the abdication, as a kind of sub-frequency running under everything she wrote. A question she was carrying but not naming. There is a particular kind of identity crisis that happens when the role you have organized your entire life around simply ceases to exist. It is not the same as grief, exactly. It is more disorienting than grief, because grief has an object. This had nothing to hold. She was still herself. She had her husband, her children, her faith. But the scaffolding around all of it, the scaffolding of purpose and position, and the forward-facing certainty that what she was doing mattered, was gone. The contrast between the two women in this moment is one of the things I find most historically striking about the entire Romanov story. Maria Feodorovna had always known at some level that power was temporary. She had watched her father-in-law assassinated. She had watched her husband die at 49. She had watched Nicholas struggle for 23 years in a role he was never quite suited for. She had a Danish pragmatism born, I suspect, from growing up without great resources in a small country that knew its own limits, that allowed her to look directly at catastrophe without needing to call it something else. Alexandra had no such pragmatism. She had certainty. The certainty that had sustained her through 23 years of being unpopular, being misunderstood, being the German woman in the press and the whispers. That certainty was that they were right, that God's design placed the Tsar on the throne, that holding the autocracy was a sacred duty, not merely a political preference, and when the abdication happened, that certainty was not just challenged, it was demolished. Did Alexandra blame herself? The historical record is ambiguous. There are no letters where she explicitly takes responsibility for what happened. What there is in those first weeks of confinement is a woman in a strange kind of suspended state, waiting for Nicholas to return, nursing the children, going to church, writing letters, and trying, I think, to reconstruct a self that made sense in a world where the organizing principle of everything had been removed. Let me tell you about the household in those first days of house arrest. The servants who had fled were replaced slowly with fewer servants. The guards at the gates changed. The world outside the palace carried on its revolutionary business without reference to what was happening inside. And inside the family, Nicholas, Alexandra, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, Alexei, were suddenly alone together in a way they had never quite been before. No ministers coming and going, no diplomatic functions, no court obligations, no role, just them. And something rather unexpected happened. Nicholas, relieved of the weight of empire, became more himself than he had been in years. He walked in the park, he chopped wood, he read aloud to the children, he played with Alexei in the snow. His diary entries from this period, which had always registered the weather and the walks and the quiet domestic observations alongside the state affairs, now register almost exclusively the quiet domestic observations, because that was all there was, and he was by every account genuinely happier, which raises its own question, doesn't it? The man who'd been bearing the weight of the Russian Empire for 23 years was, when that weight was taken from him, however catastrophically, however against his will, lighter, more present, more fully there. Alexandra, watching this, must have felt something complicated. Relief that he was not broken. Love for the man she'd always seen more clearly than his public role had allowed others to see. And perhaps something that was not quite grief, and not quite guilt, but carried some of both the recognition that the person they had been sacrificing everything to protect the dynasty, the autocracy, the God-given throne, had perhaps never been quite the same person as the man who was now reading aloud to the children in the evening. Maria Feodorovna, meanwhile, was navigating her own version of this new world. She had left Mogilev after those 2 days with Nicholas. She would never see him again. She did not know that yet. She went to Kiev, then to the Crimea, moving carefully through a country that was reorganizing itself around the absence of everything she had built her life inside. She was 70 years old. She was still by every account extraordinary, still managing, still thinking, still refusing to simply fall apart because falling apart had never been an option she considered. One letter she wrote from this period to Nicholas during the captivity arrives at something I find remarkable in its combination of honesty and love. Your thoughts and prayers never leave you. I think of you day and night and sometimes feel so sick at heart that I believe I cannot bear it any longer. But God is merciful. He will give us strength for this terrible ordeal. She was 70 years old, and she was still finding strength, still offering it, still holding. The gap between what these two women were made of, Maria and Alexandra, had never been more visible than in these months after the abdication. It is not a gap of virtue. I want to be careful about that. Maria was not better than Alexandra. She was different. She had had different experiences that built different kinds of resilience. She had lost people early and kept moving. She had arrived in Russia as a stranger and made it home through work and will. She had no illusions about power because she had held it and watched it end and lived to 70 without requiring it to define her. Alexandra had none of those inoculations. She was in this particular moment genuinely unprepared for the world she'd entered, and yet, what came next in the months of captivity would reveal something about Alexandra that not even the people closest to her had fully seen, a quality that nobody was expecting. Because when the external trappings were gone, the title, the role, the mysticism, the politics, the fear, what remained was something quiet and steady and rather extraordinary. What remained was a mother, and in the specific extraordinary circumstances of the captivity that followed, that turned out to be the thing that mattered most of all. There's a photograph taken in the spring of 1917. Alexandra is sitting in a wheelchair in the park of the Alexander Palace. She's doing needlework. The guards are visible at the edge of the frame, and she's looking down at her embroidery with a concentration that is almost unnerving in its normalcy. Not performing stoicism for the camera, not staring defiantly at the lens, just embroidering, in a wheelchair, under guard, in the wreckage of everything she had known. That photograph is, I think, a more honest portrait of who Alexandra was, of who all these women were, than anything written about them at the time. Because the captivity period is where the public story and the private reality diverge most sharply. The public story was still being written by people who'd never been in the room. The private reality was a family together making the best of something that had no good side to make the best of. and finding somehow that they could. The first period of confinement was at Tsarskoye Selo itself. March through August of 1917. The palace they had lived in for 20 years was now their prison. They could move within it and within its gardens. The outside world came to them filtered through guards who were at this stage still relatively respectful. The servants who remained were loyal. The tutors remarkably stayed. Sidney Gibbes, the children's English tutor. Pierre Gilliard, the Swiss, who taught them French. Both of them chose to remain when they could have left. Both of them in doing so gave the family something that money and titles could not have purchased: the daily normalcy of school lessons. Nicholas chopped wood. He had always enjoyed physical exercise, and now with no ceremonial duties or state business, he was free to pursue it without restraint. He chopped enormous quantities of wood. The diary entries from this period have a rhythm that is almost meditative. Morning walk, lessons with Alexei, lunch, afternoon in the garden, chopped wood, dinner. Read aloud to the children in the evening, over and over, day after day. Alexandra, who had spent the previous years managing her deteriorating health, alongside the management of an empire, was now managing only her deteriorating health. Which should have felt like less. Instead, it seems to have freed something in her. The letters from Tsarskoye Selo are different from the letters of the war years, quieter, more present. She writes about the garden, about what Alexei said at breakfast, about which flowers are coming up along the path. She wrote to a friend, "All the past is a dream, one keeps only tears and grateful memories. One by one all earthly things slip away. There is a question I keep coming back to in this period, and I am going to put it to you directly. How do you behave when everything has been taken from you? Not the small things. Everything. Title, power, freedom, future." The answer for most of history's figures under such conditions varies enormously. Some fall apart, some become bitter, some become paranoid, some in the extremity of what they are facing become something that they were not quite before, something more essentially themselves. In August of 1917 the family was moved. The provisional government had decided that Tsarskoye Selo was too close to the capital, too visible, too potentially accessible to both rescuers and those who wished the family harm. They were sent to Tobolsk, a provincial town in western Siberia, about 200 miles north of the nearest railway line, accessible by boat for most of the year, by frozen river in winter, remote, quiet. They travelled by train labelled the Japanese Red Cross mission to avoid attracting attention. They took their dogs, they took their tutors, they took 39 retainers who chose to go with them. They moved into the governor's mansion, which had a constant guard of soldiers and which was with what seems like either dark Bolshevik humour or complete obliviousness, called Freedom House. Tobolsk was in many ways the gentlest period of the captivity. The townspeople were by all accounts warm. They would kneel when the family passed on the way to church. They would make the sign of the cross when one of the children appeared at a window. Gifts of food came from the town. Nuns from a local convent brought eggs and sugar. There was a school schedule. There was embroidery and painting and letters written to friends. Anastasia wrote to a friend in Petrograd, "I write to you though I am certain this letter will never reach you." It did reach her. It was kept for the rest of her life. In the evenings, Nicholas read aloud. He had been reading aloud to the family for years, but now there was nothing else competing for the time. Anastasia wrote in one of her surviving letters from Tobolsk, "In the evenings our father reads to us. That is all. No comment on the political situation, no anxiety expressed, just the fact of it. The father in the evening reading, and the children gathered around. The four sisters in this period drew closer together than they had ever been. The ordinary friction of adolescence, the rivalry, The impatience, the need for private space had not disappeared entirely. They were still 4 distinct people, with 4 distinct temperaments in close quarters. But the specific quality of their bond deepened. Olga wrote poetry. Tatiana organized the household routine with her characteristic efficiency, maintaining structure in the shapelessness of confinement. Maria, as Maria always had, befriended everyone around her. She managed somehow to make even the guards at Tobolsk feel seen. Anastasia, 17 years old in what should have been the most expansive years of her life, remained the family comedian. The jokes were still landing. The energy was still there, even in a compound with guards at the gate. This more than anything tells me something important about those girls. But the world was not standing still. While the family was in Tobolsk, the Bolsheviks had seized power in November of 1917. Everything changed. The provisional government that had been in its own fumbling way managing the family's captivity, with some degree of humanity gone, replaced by people who had no particular interest in humanity when it came to the former Tsar. The correspondence began to be monitored more closely. The food allowance was reduced. The staff was cut. The routines that had provided structure slowly became harder to maintain. And in April of 1918, something happened that I find genuinely hard to describe without feeling the weight of it. The family was separated. Nicholas, Alexandra and Maria were moved first to Yekaterinburg. The other 4 children, Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia and Alexei, were left behind in Tobolsk for a month, because Alexei had suffered another severe bleeding episode and could not travel. 1 month. For the first time in their lives, really, the 4 Otma sisters faced something without their parents in the next room. Olga 22, Tatiana 20, Anastasia 16, and Alexei 13, unable to walk, being nursed by his older sisters, while their mother and father were somewhere unreachable. The letters from this period are different. They're still trying to be normal, still talking about the weather and the lessons and the dog, but underneath you can feel it. The thinning of something. The awareness, perhaps for the first time, of how contingent everything was. They were reunited in May, in Yekaterinburg, at a house the Bolsheviks had taken from a local merchant named Ipatiev. They called it the House of Special Purpose, which is one of those bureaucratic phrases that sounds neutral and means anything but. Let me describe that house to you. It was surrounded by 2 high wooden fences. The windows were sealed with newspapers and paint. There were machine gun emplacements outside. When Anastasia tried to open the 1 small ventilation window in her room to get some air, a guard fired a shot through it. That is what I mean by conditions deteriorated. They could only speak Russian, difficult for Alexandra, who thought more fluently in English. Their cameras were confiscated. Their remaining belongings were searched and taken. The gold bracelets on Alexandra and the girls' wrists guards tried to remove them by force. They were allowed 1 hour of exercise per day in the small rear garden. The family doctor, Yevgeny Botkin, chose to stay with them. He had not been required to. He stayed. There was a maid, Anna Demidova, a cook named Karitonov, a footman named Trupp. All of them chose to remain when they could have left. 4 ordinary people who decided, in the specific circumstances of that house in Yekaterinburg, that loyalty to these specific human beings mattered more than their own safety. I think about them often. What did the women do in the House of Special Purpose they read? They wrote letters. They prayed. Alexandra's devotion to God, which had sustained her through everything, was the thing that held in that house more than anything else. The girls read to each other. They played cards. They talked. And quietly over several weeks they did something practical. They took the family jewels, the diamonds, the sapphires, the rubies that had survived the searches and the confiscations, and they began sewing them into clothing, into the linings of corsets, into the seams of bodices, into pillows, into hats. The logic was simple and heartbreaking. If they were ever allowed to escape or to go into genuine exile, they would need resources. They would need something to live on. Each of the 4 daughters was carrying by later forensic estimate over a kilogram of stones hidden in the layers of what she wore. I want to stay with this image for a moment. 4 young women in the evening sewing jewels into fabric with the careful small stitches of people who've been trained in needlework since childhood. Not panicking, not despairing, doing something practical. Preparing for a future they believed perhaps with the last of their hope might still be possible. There is a historical comparison that has been made many times between Alexandra and Marie Antoinette. Both foreign-born queens who arrived in their adopted countries as young women and were never quite accepted. Both blamed for the downfall of dynasties they had not created and could not sustain alone. Both imprisoned. Both misunderstood. Both in the end facing something final with a dignity that surprised even their enemies. The comparison is imperfect, as all comparisons across time are, but there is something in it that I think is worth naming. The particular quality of certain women who face catastrophe, not with the rage that gets remembered, but with the stillness that gets forgotten. Marie Antoinette on the tumbril to her execution accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. She said, "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Even then, even there, Alexandra in the final weeks in that house maintained her habits. She read, she prayed. She wrote in her diary in handwriting that the people who have studied it say never deteriorated, never became the scrawl of someone losing their grip. On the 12th of July, 1918, 5 days before the end, she wrote about the weather. She wrote about how hot it was. She noted that they had been allowed into the garden. She wrote the temperature. That is the woman history has spent over a century calling cold. Writing the temperature in her diary, 5 days before. On the night of the 16th of July, 1918, at roughly midnight, Dr. Botkin was woken by the house commandant. He was told to wake the family. They were told they were being moved. For their own safety, they dressed. Alexandra asked for chairs for herself and for Alexei, who could not stand easily. The chairs were brought, and she sat down, waiting. What she was waiting for was not what she'd been told she was waiting for. But the ending of their story is not the whole of their story, and the whole of their story, for all its tragedy, carries within it something I think you can only see if you look at it from the right angle. Not the dynastic drama, not the political collapse, but the thing underneath all of it. 7 people in a basement room who stayed together, who chose until the last moment to face whatever was coming with the person next to them. Nicholas lifted Alexei in his arms. He told the family, "Well, we're going to get out of this place." He was wrong about that, but he was holding his son, and that in the end is what the Romanov women were. Not symbols, not cautionary tales, mothers, daughters, sisters, people who loved each other and faced what came. Maria Feodorovna was still alive when all of this happened, in the Crimea, then in Denmark, living on for another decade in the firm private conviction that they had survived. Her story is where we are going one last time as this long journey comes to its close. April 1919. The port of Yalta on the Black Sea coast of Crimea. A British warship, the Marlborough, is sitting in the harbour, and on the dock, surrounded by a small crowd of Romanov relatives and Russian refugees, is a 71-year-old woman. She's refusing to board, not because she cannot. Because the other refugees on the dock, Russian aristocrat servants, people with no claim on the British Navy's time except that they had nowhere else to go, had not yet been allowed aboard, and she would not leave without them. The captain had been given orders to retrieve the Empress Dowager. Just her. She looked at him and said, essentially, "Everyone comes or I do not go." The captain relented. They loaded everyone. and only then, when the last refugee had found a place on the deck, did Maria Feodorovna walk up the gangplank. That moment is not often included in histories of the Romanovs, but I think it is one of the most important things she ever did, because it tells you in a single gesture exactly who she was. Not a woman who had been defeated, a woman who had survived, and who even in the moment of her own escape was still counting the people around her. As the Marlborough steamed out of the harbour, a British ship carrying officers of the Imperial Guard passed it heading the other way, and across the water those officers began to play the Russian imperial anthem for the last Empress Dowager of Russia. Steaming away from the country she had arrived in as an 18-year-old girl, the country she had spent 53 years learning to love, leaving it behind in the cold grey water of the Black Sea. She was by all accounts composed. She stood on the quarterdeck, she listened to the anthem, she did not weep publicly. That was not her way. She went first to England, to Sandringham, to stay with her sister Alexandra, now the Dowager Queen of England. And then she went home, back to Denmark, back to the country she had left as a young woman. She chose to live at Vidør, a seaside villa near Copenhagen, that she and her sister Alexandra had bought together in 1906 in better days, a place of their own. Two old women in a house by the sea in the country where both of them had begun, and she refused. For the remaining 9 years of her life, Maria Feodorovna refused to accept that Nicholas and Alexandra and the children were dead. Nobody saw Nicky killed, she would say. She kept their photographs everywhere. She would not allow memorial services to be held for them in her home. She wrote in her private diary, "I am sure they all got out of Russia, and now the Bolsheviks are trying to hide the truth." Was this denial? Of course it was. Even her own daughter, Olga Alexandrovna, who had made peace with the truth, said later quietly, "I am sure that deep in her heart my mother had steeled herself to accept the truth some years before her death." But something else was also happening, something harder to name. A woman who had survived the death of a fiancé, the death of a husband, the death of a son, the loss of a country, the loss of everything she had spent 50 years building, deciding in her final decade that hope was the last thing she would give up. Not because she was weak, because she was at her absolute core someone who kept going. And sometimes keeping going requires you to hold in one hand what you know, and in the other what you cannot bear to know. Maria Feodorovna died on the 13th of October 1928. She was 80 years old. She died in the house by the sea that she had shared with her sister. She'd outlived Nicholas. She'd outlived Alexandra. She'd outlived all 5 grandchildren. She had outlived by 10 years the dynasty she'd come to Russia to be part of. She was buried at Roskilde Cathedral, the traditional burial place of the Danish royal family. And she stayed there for 78 years, until in September of 2006 her remains were transferred to Russia, brought home finally to the Saints Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, where she was laid to rest beside her husband Alexander III, the man who had held her hand at his brother's deathbed, the man who had called her his angel. 80 years of waiting to go home. Now, let me tell you about the family she had refused to believe was gone, because their story did not end in the summer of 1918. Not really. In the mid-1970s, almost 60 years after that night in Yekaterinburg, a geologist named Alexander Avdonin, who'd been hearing rumours his entire life about where the Romanov family was buried, went looking. He found them, a mass grave in the forest outside Yekaterinburg. He was in the Soviet Union. He could not tell anyone. He reburied the bones and kept the secret for over a decade. It was not until 1988, after Gorbachev had begun to loosen the Soviet Union's grip on its own past, that Avdonin approached the government. The formal excavation took place in 1991 after the Soviet Union fell. 9 sets of remains, Nicholas, Alexandra, 3 of their daughters, the family doctor Yevgeny Botkin, the maid, the cook, the footman. 2 children were missing, Alexei, and one of the daughters the forensic teams initially disagreed on which. The rest were buried in St. Petersburg in 1998, on the 17th of July, exactly 80 years to the day after they were killed. Russian President Boris Yeltsin attended the ceremony. He spoke about the need for reconciliation, about Russia facing its past, about the fact that shame and repentance were the beginning of national dignity. The Russian Orthodox Church, which had canonized the Romanovs as passion bearers in 2000, meaning they were recognized as having died for their faith, did not attend the 1998 ceremony. They had their own doubts about the identification. The relationship between official Russia and the memory of the Romanovs has never been entirely simple, and it probably never will be. In 2007, a team of archaeologists found a second grave, 60 meters from the first, 2 more sets of remains, burned almost beyond recognition but not quite. Scientific testing confirmed Alexei and Maria, the 3rd daughter, the warm one, the one who had wanted nothing more than a simple life and someone to come home to. Found, identified, confirmed in 2008. So, all of them, all 7, accounted for at last. It took 90 years. There is one more thing I want to tell you. About a letter. Dr. Botkin, the family physician who chose to stay, who went into the Apertiev house, knowing what staying might mean, who died in that basement alongside the family he served on the night before the end he was writing. He was awake. He was writing a letter. He never finished it. But the letter survives. In it he wrote about loyalty, about what it means to decide when the last exit is still technically open to remain anyway. He wrote, "I am dead in my own estimation, and so I am quite reconciled to death." And then he kept writing. I've been thinking about that letter for a long time, about what it means to stay with people not because you are required to, but because you have decided that their story is yours now. Botkin, the maid Anna Demidova, the cook, the footman, 4 people who could have walked away and chose not to, whose names are on the same plaque, in the same cathedral, alongside the people they served. What is the legacy of the Romanov women? This is where I want to end, not with the dynasty, not with the revolution, but with them. Maria Feodorovna came to Russia as a stranger and made it her country. She did it with warmth and work and the patient, stubborn willingness to learn. She raised a son who was by most accounts a genuinely decent man, in a role that required something beyond decency. She survived things that broke other people. She chose at the very end to carry hope rather than certainty. That is not naivety. That is a specific kind of courage. Alexandra arrived in Russia already carrying a grief she had never been given space to process. She loved her husband and her children with everything she had. She made catastrophic political judgments, partly from fear, partly from a belief system that the world had moved past without her noticing, and she faced what came to her in the end with a stillness that I find even now, even knowing everything, quietly extraordinary. She was wrong about a great many things. She was not wrong about love. Olga, the poet, the sensitive one who carried more than she could hold and kept going anyway. Tatiana, the efficient one, the one with the capable hands, who might have been a remarkable woman in a world that had given her room. Maria, the warm one who walked into every room and made the people in it feel seen. Anastasia, the laughing one who kept the light on in rooms where the light had no business surviving. 4 young women who grew up behind glass and then stepped through it briefly into a world that did not quite know what to do with them, who nursed wounded soldiers and fell in love with impossible people, and stayed up too late laughing and sewed jewels into their clothing for a future they did not get to live. Here is what I believe, having spent this time with their story. They are remembered in fragments. the mystery of Anastasia, the image of the last Tsar, the mythology of Rasputin. But what the fragments miss is the texture of who they actually were. The dogs and the photographs and the notebooks full of poetry. The cold baths every morning and the perfume preferences and the way Anastasia still managed to be funny in a house with sealed windows and machine gun emplacements outside. The small, specific, irreducible realness of them. History tends to remember the people who shaped events. These women were shaped by events. They were not at the centre of the political decisions that brought the dynasty down. They were not in the room where the choices were made. They were in the other room, nursing the sick, writing letters, doing embroidery by lamplight, trying every day to be present for the people they loved. And I keep thinking about what that is actually. Not heroism, not political strategy, just the daily, ordinary, irreplaceable practice of showing up for the person in the next bed, for the soldiers who needed someone to talk to, for the children who needed a father to read aloud in the evenings, for the guards who hadn't expected to be treated like human beings. The Romanov women did not save the dynasty. Nobody could have, but they saved each other, in the specific private human way that people save each other by being present, by choosing loyalty, by staying. And I think that is in the end the truest thing I can say about them. So, that is their story. From Maria Feodorovna arriving by warship in St. Petersburg harbour in 1866, a Danish girl with a borrowed religion and a whole country to learn, to the same woman 53 years later standing on a different warship sailing away from the same harbour, taking everyone she could with her. From Alex of Hesse-Sunny playing in the gardens of a German palace, dragging her little sister everywhere she went, to Alexandra Feodorovna writing the temperature in her diary in a room with sealed windows, still there, still present, still herself. You've been with me for a long time tonight. Through 12 chapters, through 50 years of history, through love stories and tragedies and the specific way that certain families manage to remain human in conditions designed to make it very difficult. Thank you. That is not a small thing to give your time and your attention to the dead, to say these people existed, they mattered, their story is worth sitting with, because it is. If this journey has meant something to you, if you found yourself moved or surprised, or if you saw something in these women that you recognize from your own life, please leave a comment below. Tell me which of them stayed with you. Tell me what you are thinking at midnight with the lights low and the story still settling. I read every comment, every one. And if you have been sleeping to these stories for a while now and have not yet subscribed, this would be a kind moment to do it. It keeps the light on. It tells me these stories are worth telling. And the next story I want to bring you is one I have been thinking about for a long time. A different world, a different era. But the same question really that this one has been asking all along. What do people become when everything is stripped away? What do they hold on to? What holds on to them? I will see you then. Sleep well.